And as usual, TikTok is not working, but we are live on YouTube and Instagram. How you guys all doing? We're responding to Skeptical Agnostic again, who responded to us on a video responding to him on the logical problem of the Trinity. And with that, I am joined today. Yeah.
I should clarify. It's on the logical problem of the Incarnation. I think the.
Logical problem of the Incarnation.
I think you might have put Trinity in the title, but.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Whoops. Whatever. I think people will get it.
Yeah. Okay. I should go probably edit that after this video, but that's the background to today's video. But before that, really quick, we'll go ahead and introduce all of ourselves. So, as usual, my name is Christian Apologetics research channel, and so I'm gonna pause for this one very, very soon. Where did you get the idea for the channel, Mr. Logos? And with that, we'll kick it away to your introduction, Roy. So, how did you get the idea for Imago Logos?
So, the image of God and how it's Imago Dei in Latin, and how Logos is, reason or Christ. That's like the translation in Greek. That's where I got it from. So it's a combination of those two.
Yeah. And he says, what is this countdown? It's the countdown. Mortal, hello, peoples. Oy vey, stream started and there's already a
blender. Saying that in the chat. Yo, bro, what are we doing?
Anyway, we're going to move on to the Lamb Apologetics. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You know, your neighborhood pseudo-philosopher here, going to be pseudo-speaking on all the philosophical topics today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And then we also have Maronite Scholastic. I clicked on your profile picture for some reason. But anyway, go ahead and take it away.
What's up? I'm Maronite Scholastic. I am a regular Slopstack poster on Substack. Make articles on like philosophy, Catholic dogmatics, and stuff like that. So I'm excited to talk about the LPI here, since when we last did the first video on this, I unfortunately we had to skip out on the section I added from the medieval tradition to kind of cut down on stuff. So I'm happy to bring up that stuff now. Y'all gonna love it.
Awesome. And this is the tier list I gave for arguments for Christianity. So there's that.
I think resurrection is. I think the general argument for miracles is definitely up there.
Yeah.
Not just like if you want to include let's say the other events from Jesus' ministry.
Yeah. Motives of credibility are always just going to be like the best argument for it.
Yep. Okay. Now we've got the slideshow. LPI debunked again, logical problem of the Incarnation debunked again. So go ahead and take it away, Roy.
Oh yeah. So I guess to kind of start, we should probably start to give a brief recap. So if you go to the next slide. So Skeptical Agnostic released a video on the Incarnation where he argues that Christians face a prima facie problem of inconsistency, and he's specifically referring to the logical problem of the Incarnation. He doesn't say it, he doesn't explicitly call it that, but given the content of his video, it's clear that's what he's referring to. And then he says that the only way, or the only plausible way around this, is an appeal to two natures. And then he concludes by arguing that the appeal to two natures is incoherent. and so therefore there's no sufficient defeater, and so the prima facie contradiction just results in a like contradiction simplicator. And then after that, we released a response to that, which argues that firstly, an appeal to two natures is not necessary to refute the LPI, and then secondly, an appeal to two natures is coherent.
Were you still there?
Oh yeah, my bad. My mic got muted. So kind of to give some background info on our video, and the reason why I bring this up is that it kind of got brought up because at a certain point, it kind of felt like he was kind of accusing us of doing a 3v1 or like a 4v1, because there's like 4 people here right now, right? Or on the video, it was 3 collaborators, but Bust Down helped. I don't know why we didn't add it as a collaborator. Probably should have. But anyways,
Yeah, bro, you all
so
just hated me.
I guess, bro. But anyways, so the script was primarily written by me, and then Lamb added the part about supervenience, and then Lamb, Bust Down, and Apollo sort of helped to review and edit it. And as I said, Lamb wrote the supervenience part specifically, and then I just acted as like an editor for that. And the reason why
Yeah.
Apollos was
And,
listed
and
as
by
a,
that,
yeah.
like, what he means is that he just tagged me as a collaborator when I didn't do a thing. But yeah, go
I
ahead.
mean, it was mainly because like we were doing you were doing the response to Skeptical Agnostic on John the Baptist, and I was kind of checking out his channel. I was like, hey, this Incarnation video seems interesting. So it seems like something kind of in my interests. So I was like, I might
Yeah.
as well get Apollos in because why not?
Yeah. But
And
yeah, like over here we're trying to keep it to a 2 videos per response kind of policy. I heard from someone way back when that if you respond to more people if you respond to people more times than the other person can respond, they'll probably stop responding. So there's that. So yeah. Oh, so you guys did respond again. Yeah, we're responding again right now.
right. So I guess we can kind of move on to like a brief recap of like our video, or more in-depth one than what we gave before, right? So you can summarize skeptical agnostic sort of, I guess you could say, general argument, like as such, that being that there's a prima facie contradiction or unintelligibility in the incarnation. Premise two, diophysitism is the only way to provide a relevant sufficient defeater. Premise three, diophysis claims that there are 2 natures but collapses into 1 nature, in other words, a contradiction. So there is no sufficient defeater, so the incarnation is inconsistent. Um, and in order to defend premise one, he indirectly refers to the logical problem of the Trinity, or I'm sorry, the incarnation. Like he brings up, like for example, that Jesus is man and God, and thus both has both sets of properties. And then he says that okay, well, humanity and divinity imply different sets of properties or contradictory sets of properties. And he gives the example of God. God is immortal, but man is mortal. Like that's not referencing the LPI explicitly, but that type of, I guess you could say, argument is really only like referenced when you're talking about the LPI. So I think it's fair to characterize it as a reference to it. However, he does something a bit unique and says that, well, he doesn't say it directly again, but he kind of says it's a prima facie problem, meaning that like people can avoid it by an appeal to 2 natures specifically, hence why he has premise 2. But then, in order to get around that, he kind of argues that it's actually impossible for something to have 2 natures, which is why he has premise 3, and that's how he gets his conclusion 1 and 2. And so, if you go to the next slide, in our video, the way that we kind of responded to this is we first gave a rebutting defeater where we went over methodology, and then given said methodology, we gave an argument for the incarnation being consistent. And then, more to be more specific, we used Branson's methodology and then translated the doctrinal commitments into some adequate formal language, and then from there showed that the regimentation was both adequate and consistent. And we did that by showing that it was satisfiable, which we'll get to in a bit. And then using this, we kind of responded to premises 1 and 2 by saying that the prima facie contradiction can be resolved in a twofold manner, because we distinguish the senses of the predicates. So God is immortal while man is mortal, but we distinguish the sense of mortal. So when we say man is mortal, we mean that he has a body and soul which are separable, and death is the separation of body and soul. So that's why we're defining mortality like that. But when we say God is not mortal, what we mean is that he's necessary and eternal. And then secondly, we distinguish between common and essential properties. So let's say being ignorant, that's like a common property because most people lack propositional knowledge of all things, but it's not essential, right? In the sense that it wouldn't be a requirement to have a human nature, right? And I wouldn't say it necessarily flows from humanity either. So something can be like perfectly human and not be ignorant, basically. And then if you go to the next slide, so for premise 2, we specifically responded to it in a twofold manner. So firstly, we said that there's non-diophysite theories of the incarnation, specifically metaphysicism, and at the very least, this theory would explicitly maintain the doctrinal commitments. And skeptical agnostic hasn't really given any adequate reason to dismiss them, and thus he hasn't actually done enough to prove that the incarnation itself is inconsistent. Because remember, his argument is against diophysitism, so it really just shows that at most it would just show that diophysitism, given his metaphysics, which we'll cover later on, is inconsistent, right? But that doesn't prove that the incarnation itself is inconsistent. And then the second way we responded is by saying that giving a metaphysical account involving diophysitism is just unnecessary for demonstrating that there is no inconsistency. Because diophysitism is just a metaphysical account meant to answer metaphysical and theological questions. Strictly speaking, it's not necessary to sort of argue for that in a discussion about logical coherence. So now we can move on to premise 3, which is that nothing can have two natures, or that Christ cannot have two natures because it collapses into one nature. The way that we dealt with that is by saying that basically, firstly, his argument presupposes a false definition of nature. And so because we disputed that assumption, we disputed the argument itself and showed that it was unsound. And then the second thing we can point out is that it was just a non sequitur. And so this kind of leads us into Skeptical Agnostic's current response to us, where he seems to concede that the incarnation is formally consistent, but then claims that one, the model of the incarnation he presented was implicitly inconsistent, and two, implicit inconsistency is what is relevant here. And note by implicitly inconsistent, I mean like metaphysically inconsistent. And we'll go into why I think those are like the same. But the next point we can kind of go on, or I guess this could be like a methodological point, is we can kind of start by talking about what a model is. And this isn't unique to like skeptical agnostic or just the LPI, because this topic comes up, or this word comes up like basically everywhere now. Like you'll see people talking about models of the Trinity, models of the incarnation. I even see people talking about like models of the resurrection, whatever that might mean. And so I think it's important to kind of clarify like what exactly is a model, why is it relevant, and how should we be using the term. So like for example, skeptical agnostic says that he gives a specific model of the hypostatic union. Right? So in order to kind of understand what's going on here, I think it's useful to go over what a model is. So as I just explained, all of this raises the question, what is a model? Well, I think in my opinion, there's sort of two relevant definitions found in the literature for what a model is. So there's the first definition, which Sijuwade gives, and he says that a model, and he basically defines model as a collection of propositions that shows how it could be that another set of propositions is true, right? So he says another collection of target propositions is true, to be more specific, right? So that's I guess you could say Sijuwade's definition, where he follows Plantinga in that, and that seems to be the definition that like skeptical agnostic is using. However, I think the more relevant definition would be a model theoretic one. And so, for example, Peter Smith in his sort of a study guide for logic says model theory is about mathematical structures and about how to characterize them characterize and classify them using formal languages. Put another way, it concerns the relationship between a mathematical theory, regimented as a collection of formal sentences, and the structures which realize that theory, i.e., the structures which we can interpret the theory as being true of, i.e., the structures which provide a model for the theory. So to kind of explain, right, there is the Sijuwade definition, which is just about giving a like set of propositions that sort of accounts for a different set of target propositions. But then there's the model theoretic definition, which is about providing a mathematical structure which satisfies some set of sentences. And I think that the model theoretic one is going to be sort of, I guess you could say, more relevant here. And kind of, if you go to the next slide, kind of explain why. So the context of the video pertains to the logical problem of the incarnation. Remember, the initial video where we like are responding to brought up the LPI, right? And the same point can be applied to the LPT in any videos that bring up the LPT. Of course, Skeptical Agnostic doesn't reference it by name, but I mean, given the content of his video, it's kind of clear what he's talking about. So in the context of like logic or like a logical issue, it would seem to be the most it seems to be most appropriate to use the definition of model found in, well, the field of logic or math, right? And this is even the case even though like Skeptical Agnostic wants to claim that his issue is a metaphysical, not logical one. Because the issue is he is still talking about things like consistency or set theory, etc., right? Because he wants to talk about metaphysical consistency, and well, that still has to do with logic, which we'll see that later on. And plus, as I kind of alluded to, just claiming that you're arguing for metaphysical inconsistency, that's just not enough to show that, you know, we don't have to use, I guess you could say, like a formal language or like the terms associated with that. As a further point, Sujiwadi's definition seems a bit like idiosyncratic and inadequate for this issue. Like, for example, if we're using a model theoretic definition, then giving a model is actually relevant to consistency because if a language is sound incomplete, then satisfiability implies syntactic consistency and vice versa. However, if we're using Sujiwadi's definition, then it seems to be puzzling as to how giving a model would even be relevant here. If you go to the next slide, so the reason why this clarification is important is that because whenever I talked about a model in my response, I'm typically going to be using model in the sense that it's used in like math. So the mathematical structure that that satisfies a set of sentences, right? So like in my video, for example, on the LPI, the set of sentences was meant to represent the commitments of the incarnation. And the model I gave satisfies that set of sentences, and hence you could call it a model of the incarnation, right? And likewise, when we just in general talk about giving a model of D in context to like a logical problem, where like D is some view or doctrine, it seems that the most appropriate interpretation of the claim would be that one, there are some mathematical structures that satisfy some set of sentences S in some formal language, and two, this set S adequately represents the commitments of D. So to give an example, if I say that in response to the LPT, Branson provided a model of the Trinity, that would imply that Branson gave some mathematical structure that satisfies a set of sentences S, such that S adequately represents the doctrinal commitments of the Trinity. And that's what he does in his dissertation, of course, right? Now, this might be kind of a bit, I guess you could say, like, I don't know, abstract, hard to follow maybe. But I think giving this example might kind of help clear it up, right? So let's say you have the following like formulas in first order logic, right? So you have there exists some x such that x is h, right? So maybe you want to assign the meaning of human to h, right? So you're saying that there exists something which is human or just humans exist, right? And then the second formula could be, you know, for all x, if x is h, then x is m. So maybe you're saying that all men are mortal, right? So, you know, if something is human, then it's mortal, right? So these two formulas would be called sentences, right? And from there, we can let T be some set such that both of those formulas are its only members. In other words, the set contains those two and those two only, right? So we would call that set a theory. In other words, it's a set of sentences, right? But then let's just suppose that there's some mathematical structure S such that the domain is just includes zero, and that zero is an element of H, and that zero is an element of M. In other words, well, you can just read it yourself there if you want to see the notation. So this structure S is a model of T because every formula in T is true in or satisfied by the structure. So, for instance, one of the sentences claims that there exists some object which is H, and the structure, and in the structure there is at least one object which is a member of H, and thus the sentence is true in the structure. Likewise, the conditional is also true in the structure. In other words, the set of sentences as a whole is true in the structure, meaning that the structure S satisfies the theory T. And if you want to see how we would like write that out, you can copy that or whatever. But you would read that out as S satisfies T.
Real quick, Rogan asks, Apollos, when is your debate video dropping? So I participated, for those of you guys who don't know, in a 5 versus 1 debate on Modern Day Debate, their latest debate con. They had a sort of like mini event to debate Jay Dyer on whether or not Eastern Orthodoxy is true. I was still manning Protestantism, so just to clarify, like even though I was forced to say I am a Protestant in the video, nobody knows that for sure. It at least between me and Jay, it got somewhat heated. But it didn't come to the point where I had to bring up that accusation until much later, regarding my community post, because he attacked one of my fellow teammates on basically him using AI glasses to cheat, which is definitely not what happened. But as far as like when that's supposed to drop, it's gonna be, I think James said like 2 or 3 weeks from now, so there's that. But yeah, last I checked, Sway did an interview with like a 2-hour long interview on some other channel, and I'd imagine he'd explain over there why he wasn't cheating using his AI glasses. I mean, like the whole point of Jay, his accusation was that you can use AI glasses during the break. However, everyone in that room took a break. So by that logic, since Jay had a smartphone on him, Jay must have cheated because he took a break. So it's a little bit hypocritical on that part. But anyway, we're here to talk about the logical problem of the incarnation. So there's that.
But yeah, to kind of continue, so what we gave, I guess you could say, before would be a more sort of simple example. I don't know if you want to call it that, but we can just call it that for sake of convenience. But besides a simple example, we can give a more, I guess you could say, complicated example to kind of show how a model might be used in the context of like a theological dispute. Specifically, we can just give the same model we gave in the initial response to Skeptical Agnostic. However, before we show that, I think it'll be useful to first describe the theory. In other words, like explain what these sentences are in the set, and then like what the predicate means. So, like firstly, we can just define the domain as being persons, bodies, souls, and substances. And for those who might not know, the domain is kind of like the set of objects that you're talking about. Kind of, if you want to describe it informally, that's how some logic textbooks will introduce it that way. So in this case, it would include persons, bodies, souls, and substances, right? And so, for example, here J would refer to Jesus, B would refer to his body, S would refer to his divine nature, and so forth, right? And then likewise, we're giving sort of a meaning to the predicates. So, you know, when you see IX, that means that X is material, or X is immaterial, sorry. And likewise, when you see that, you know, like AX, then you know that X is sinless and all good. So one way to think about this is that this is a key or interpretation. And then from there, if you go to the next slide, so kind of from there, what we can see, or given the interpretation that we laid out above, we can give the following sentences to represent the incarnation. Now, one thing you will notice here is that, like, I assigned a number to each sentence. This is just for convenience, so I can easily refer to each sentence individually. It's not because of like any particular importance to the order of each sentence, because when it comes to sets, the ordering is just irrelevant. And then after that, so if you go to the next slide, now that we have the set of sentences, we can show the actual model. Now, as said above, the model here is a structure that satisfies the set of sentences. And since this model satisfies a set of sentences which are translating the doctrinal commitments of the incarnation, we can, for sake of convenience, call this a model of the incarnation. Basically, because this model satisfies the set of sentences which represents the incarnation, it's a model of the incarnation.
I think it's also useful to note here that any model, including the incarnation being incoherent, would naturally fall outside of Sijuwadi's definition, because it is a model at the end of the day. So
Well, it's the mathematical structure view that you don't really give like a set of propositions in like the sense that Sijuwade wants the Because I think Sejawada is just talking about something different entirely. If you want me to be honest.
Yeah, like he's not talking about the LPI necessarily, but I guess what I was trying to get at is the idea that a model is quote unquote ad hoc, because Skeptical Agnostic did bring up that charge that the model was biblically ad hoc. Kind of cuts both ways when you're talking about models to begin with. So
I mean, in a
um,
sense, you can say all models are like ad hoc because they're constructed for, the particular purpose of, let's say, proving something is consistent, right? Like
yeah,
like if you look at the literal definition of ad
or
hoc,
inconsistent.
right,
Yeah.
right, like it's formed for like some specific purpose or one specific purpose, right? That's like kind of what all models are for, right? It's for the purpose of showing something is consistent,
Hmm.
at least in this context, right?
Yeah.
So to kind of give another example here, we can give like one. If you go to the next slide, we can give another example, but this time instead of the incarnation, we can use the Trinity. So first, we can give the key, and this is, if you're wondering, this is the model that I gave to Metaphysics Mike in my debate with him, and then in my response to him after he responded to me. So we can give the key, and then we can give the set of sentences, and then finally you can give the structure that satisfies the set of sentences. So you'll see that we have the domain, and then we see that F, S, and H are each in H, which means that it satisfies the set of sentences that state that they're in H. Likewise, E is an element of G, and so forth, right? So the model satisfies the set of sentences because each sentence or all the sentences are true in that structure. So at this point, kind of, if you go to the next slide, so at this point, this kind of raises the question, like, why are models important in the first place to like this kind of dispute? Because we're talking about the Trinity and Incarnation. Why are mathematical structures relevant? Well, the reason why it's relevant is that if you have a theory in some language L such that L is sound and complete, then the theory being satisfiable implies that it is consistent and vice versa, right? In other words, showing that there exists a model of the theory is sufficient to show that the theory is consistent. What is especially important is that a language like propositional logic, first order logic, and quantified modal logic with S5's axioms with a fixed domain and rigid designators, and henceforth we're just going to call it QML S5, and all these languages are just sound and complete. In other words, if we have some sentences, if you have a set of sentences in one of these languages, then there being a model of that set would imply that the theory is consistent. So, for example, the set of sentences meant to represent the incarnation is satisfiable and thus is consistent given that it's in a language which is sound and complete. However, at this point, there's kind of a sort of a big problem here because someone could object that, hey, a model satisfies a set of sentences that are regimented within a formal language, but the commitments of something like the incarnation are in a natural language. So, for example, if you go to the next slide, Branson points this out explicitly, right? And this is where he brings in the notion of adequacy, right? So he says, the question is, how would one show, using the tools of modern logic, whether or not a set of propositions is formally consistent or inconsistent? The modern logician's method of determining consistency and inconsistency only apply to sentences or formulae within an artificial language. So, in order to make any use of the tools developed by the logician, a set of propositions must be given some regimentation in some formal language, such that the logical forms of the formulae within that regimentation adequately represent the logical forms of the propositions. Within this artificial language, questions of consistency can be determined, if at all, with mathematical precision. And then to kind of continue this point, he further explains what exactly it would mean to be inconsistent, right? So there's one sense in which it's inconsistent if, the language has some rules or has some rules of inference which are valid in said language, and that the regimentation entails its own negation, or for whatever reason, the inference rules for that language say that the conjunction of the members must be false, right? Or maybe it just entails an explicit contradiction. Whatever it might be, this would be called syntactically inconsistent or syntactically consistent, right? So if there's no valid proof that like a contradiction would follow or that the negation of the sentence would follow, etc., right? Then we would call it a syntactically consistent set in that specific language. However, right, suppose that there's no model of L within that language or I'm sorry, there's no model of that set of sentences within that language, and that language is sound and complete. Well, that would mean that it's unsatisfiable, and since the language is sound and complete, that would mean that it's inconsistent. But vice versa, if it is satisfiable, then it would be consistent. And so, to kind of sort of explain what Branson is saying, if you go to the next slide, we can kind of give like a summary of what Branson is saying here. Basically, what he's trying to get at is he's giving a methodology as to how one would prove something is consistent or inconsistent. Firstly, you would begin with the doctrinal commitments within the natural language. So we can, for convenience sake, refer to these commitments as D. Second, you would find some language L such that L is sound and complete, and L is expressive enough to adequately express or capture the meaning of the relevant aspects of D. In other words, you need to find some language which is adequate for D. Third, you regiment or represent these commitments in L such that the relevant meaning or logical forms of the commitments is preserved. In other words, you would need to provide some set of sentences T such that T is adequate to represent the commitments D. Finally, you would need to show that there exists a model M such that M satisfies T. Now, once you've successfully done each of these steps, you will have shown that D itself is consistent. Now, what you can see is that we can do this exact set of steps for something like the Trinity or the Incarnation, right? So, for example, that's what I did earlier. So I kind of skipped the like formal adequacy part because I didn't go into, how I know that the set of sentences adequately represents the Incarnation or Trinity. But that's because in the videos that I'm pulling those models from, we go in depth into why it would be adequate, right? So, for example, with the model of the Trinity, I got that from my response to Metaphysics Mike, and
Real
in that
quick,
response, I go in depth to why it's adequate. But yeah, Clueless, what were you saying?
Yeah, so there was a comment that was talking about consistency doesn't always mean true. That's not the context in which
It's,
he's using consistency. Truth is going to deal with certain metaphysical or nomological constraints, as well as like what is going to be adherence to specific sets of beliefs. Like, Roy will probably mention it later about like this would be like a Monty Bailey fallacy, where like when you're talking about models consistency and then you sort of fall back into, well, actually I'm talking about whether or not this thing is metaphysically or nomologically true, or it's true in sense where beliefs seem to cohere with reality in some way or another, or whatever theory of truth they're using. But yeah, no, the consistency here isn't being used in the same way that we would typically talk about truth.
right. I mean, either way, though, the topic is consistency. Like, I don't even think skeptical agnostic argued that like, oh, the Incarnation is not true, therefore you're debunked. Like he was arguing in terms of metaphysical inconsistency.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And also, Mortal says hi to modern atheism. All right. Next slide. Roy, you're muted, by the way.
All right. So where did we leave off? Hold on. All right, we left off with the methodology. So to go to the next slide, right? At this point, maybe someone will ask like, why would we care about Branson's methodology? Why consider it true? Well, to kind of answer that, Branson's methodology is twofold in reality: translation and proving consistency. The second portion, proving consistency via satisfiability, is already well established in the literature, right? Like it's already well established that first order logic, propositional logic, etc., are like sound and complete. Right, so I don't really have to go over those. And if you really want a citation, you can look at Kripke for like the claim that quantified modal logic with S5 axioms is sound and complete. Now, the first portion can be defended simply due to the fact that in an adequate translation, the truth conditions or meaning doesn't actually change, right? So, like if I adequately translated "the sky is blue" into Spanish, that's not going to change the meaning of the truth or like the truth conditions. Likewise, adequately translating "Jesus is God" into a formal language, or translating "Jesus is God and man" into a formal language, does not change the truth conditions or meaning prima facie. But like if two sentences, let's say S1 and S2, share the same meaning, then if S1 is inconsistent, then so too is S2 and vice versa, right? So to give an example, let's say I were to say that at least one dog barks and at least one cat meows. And then I were to say there exists some dog that barks, and there exists some cat that meows. These two sentences share the same exact meaning, and thus are either both consistent or both inconsistent. One way to put it is that like there's a biconditional holding between them, and because there's a biconditional, if one is inconsistent, the other is inconsistent, and vice versa. And just as a final point, this kind of procedure that Branson describes is basically like standard in like formal logic. Like we translate Socrates as man, all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal, into a formal language, and nobody alleges that like this doesn't preserve like the meaning or the content, etc. Right? As a further point, though, what is interesting is that we actually don't need the biconditional to ensure that like consistency of one sentence implies consistency of another. Like for example, suppose that you have S1 as at least one dog barks and at least one cat meows, and then you have S2 as some cat meows. A conditional holds from S1 to S2. S1 implies S2. But what this means is that if S1 is consistent, then so too is S2. This is important because, for example, even if some set of sentences meant to represent a doctrine includes more than what is necessary or sufficient to preserve the meaning of the doctrinal commitments, that set being consistent would still imply that the doctrine itself is consistent. For example, suppose I have a set of sentences that represents the necessary commitments of theism plus some extra commitments. That set being satisfiable implies that theism itself is consistent because the set would imply that theism plus some other commitments is consistent. But since the conjunct is consistent, so too are its components, right? And this is something you learn in like logic with conjunction elimination, right? Like if let's say if you have P and Q, right? If P is inconsistent, well, you're gonna have that P entails and then some contradiction, or P from P you can derive some contradiction. Well, from P and Q, you can derive P, and since we know that P is inconsistent, we know that P and Q also implies a contradiction. And this is actually something I went over in my recent video on Gregory of Nyssa and like how metaphysics might fail to refute him, right? We covered this at the end. So if you want a sort of more in-depth explanation, I would recommend going at that, right? Now, as sort of a final point, we can cover an objection if you go to the next slide. So this is one that modern atheism brought up. He kind of gave this an example right this. Like he said, you could formalize something like Bob is married and Bob is single in a way such that the formalization is consistent and satisfiable, right? I don't know if you use Bob specifically, but I think you get the point. Now, what he's probably referring to is the fact that you can give the following set of sentences in first order logic, and that this set is satisfiable, right? So you can have B is M, B is S, right? Now, although he doesn't directly state this, I think what he's trying to give is like a counterexample to Branson's methodology by showing that, it can produce a false result. If it isn't meant to be that, then oh well, I guess. But I feel like it's kind of weird to bring it up if it's not meant to be a counterexample. Like I fail to see why it would even be relevant if it's not meant to be like analogous to my formalization, right? And the reason why I bring that up is that Branson's methodology requires that the formal language and the regimentation are both adequate. So in this case, we can concede that the formal language is adequate, we can concede that the formal language is adequate and that the set of sentences itself is satisfiable. However, we would deny that this particular regimentation is adequate. This is because there is some relevant meaning of married which is not captured by the regimentation. Like, specifically, an adequate regimentation would include something like for all x, if x is m, then x is not s. Because the semantic fact that a married person is not single is clearly relevant to regimenting the set of sentences, right? Now, kind of an expected response we might get is that, like, hey, maybe your like sort of view of the incarnation that you gave, the regimentation you gave, maybe that's also inadequate, right? But the issue is that the burden of proof would be on them at that point because I already argued in depth that it is adequate in my video. So the burden would just be on them since I already gave the arguments and they would need to provide some defeater to them. And second, from what I can tell, Skeptical Agnostic already sort of conceded that like my argument for formal consistency works. And the issue is that the set of sentences being adequate was already part of the argument for formal consistency. So by conceding the argument for formal consistency, he's conceding the adequacy. So to kind of tie this back, he repeatedly claims, it's like Skeptical Agnostic repeatedly claims that he gave a model of the incarnation. And I think given the data that we've kind of covered above, it might be pedantic, but I do think it is kind of inaccurate to use this like definition of model because it seems he's using Sijuwade's definition as far as I can tell, right? I think what he's trying to say is that he gave a sort of more like metaphysically oriented account or explanation of the incarnation, right? But just know that whenever you see like him state model, he probably means something around what like Sijuwade means, right? As far as I can tell. Now, to kind of push this further into the next topic, I think this ties in well since we're already talking about models. If you go to the next two slides, you'll see we can talk about like consistency. So this is relevant because sort of the one thing we'll notice is that skeptical agnostic will be fine in conceding one type of consistency, but then he will reject another type of consistency, right? And to be fair, this does have precedent in the literature because there is precedent for saying there's multiple types of consistency or inconsistency, right? So for example, this is from Branson's 2014 dissertation, and what he says is that like you can divide up consistency and inconsistency sort of into three different types, right? So a set of sentences is explicitly inconsistent if and only if one of its members just is a negation of at least one member of the set, right? So think of like if you have a set that just had P and not P, right? Like that would be an explicit inconsistency. Now, a set is formally inconsistent if and only if an explicit contradiction can be derived given the standard rules of logic. So, for example, like the laws of logic and the classical inference rules, right? So maybe one example you could give, right, would be the set of sentences we gave earlier to represent Bob is married and Bob is single. Once we add in that extra axiom, that would become formally inconsistent. However, something is implicitly inconsistent, and I think this is, which I think this definition is probably going to be the most relevant to what we're covering here, and I'll explain why in a bit. A set is implicitly inconsistent if and only if adding some necessary proposition yields a formally inconsistent set, right? So, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the two relevant ones are going to be formal inconsistency and implicit inconsistency, and that's because like explicit inconsistency isn't really relevant because nobody accuses a doctrine of like being explicitly inconsistent. Like for example, I don't know of anyone that will like who anyone I should say I don't know of anyone serious who will say that like the incarnation is just a pure explicit inconsistency. I don't see anyone doing that. So usually the accusation is a formal or implicit inconsistency. Same thing for like the Trinity. Right. And as a side note, right, what skeptical agnostic refers to as logical consistency in his video is likely just what Branson calls formal consistency. Likewise, his usage of metaphysical consistency is probably referring to what Branson calls implicit consistency, with the qualification that the necessary propositions are added metaphysical laws, as Michael Ray talks about, right? And the sort of reading of implicit consistency as metaphysical consistency is justified in the literature. So if you go to the like next slide, you can kind of see some quotes sort of illustrating that, right? So to give one example, Branson calls the accusation that the Trinity is implicitly inconsistent as being a metaphysical problem, right? Implying that implicit inconsistency just is metaphysical inconsistency, or at least metaphysical inconsistency is in some way tied to that. Right. And then likewise, Michael Ray just straight up defines metaphysical inconsistency as being reducible to stating that a doctrine is inconsistent with the laws of metaphysics, whatever said laws are, right? So, for example, someone who accepts the PSR might state that its denial is formally consistent, but still leads to a metaphysical or implicit inconsistency because the PSR is a metaphysically necessary principle, and thus any belief that negates that principle is a metaphysical impossibility, right? So if you go to the reason why this is important is that to state that something is metaphysically inconsistent, you are saying that the thing is inconsistent with the laws of metaphysics. That is the conjunct of the laws of metaphysics and the thing is formally inconsistent, right? So like whenever we say X is inconsistent with Y, what we mean is that the conjunct of X and Y leads to a contradiction given the standard rules of logic. So the reason why that's important is that even if a discussion is about metaphysical or implicit inconsistency, so for example, is the incarnation metaphysically coherent, questions about formal consistency are still relevant. Likewise, Branson's point about consistency being decided in, or I'm sorry, issues of consistency being decided in a formal language is still applicable, right? So that's important because you can't just discard the usage of a formal language or questions about formal consistency. Right. And the reason why I brought up the example of the PSR is to show an important point. Claiming that some beliefs are metaphysically inconsistent just means that the beliefs in conjunction with some metaphysical laws results in a contradiction. In other words, the conjunct of the beliefs and the metaphysical laws would yield a formal inconsistency. Now, someone could reject PSR as a metaphysical rule, but whatever rule someone wishes to posit, claiming that something is metaphysically inconsistent still implies a type of formal inconsistency. It's just that the belief itself need not be formally inconsistent, but at the very least, the belief in conjunction with other propositions yields a formal inconsistency. All right,
Oh, bro, that died.
okay, my mic is kind of, bro. My mic always has issues, bro. This is like not fair. Whatever. So kind of above, we gave like a methodology for proving that some doctrine is formally consistent. However, I think we can easily modify this to like produce a methodology allowing us to prove that a doctrine is metaphysically consistent, right? So, firstly, you just begin with the doctrinal commitments within the natural language, like we did before, right? And you can refer to these as D. But then, right, you add on this extra step of finding the relevant set of metaphysical laws or metaphysically necessary propositions. For convenience, we can refer to this set as C, right? Now, the set of commitments that we are trying to prove is consistent would be the union of D and C, right? And then from there, the methodology is the same, except instead of trying to prove that D is consistent, you're not proving that the union of D and C is consistent, right? So really not much changes in the methodology. It's just that instead of proving that D is formally consistent, you're proving that D and C are like consistent together, formally speaking, right? So if you wanted to prove, on the contrary, that D is metaphysically inconsistent, what you would have to show is that the conjunct of D and C, in other words, the union set of D and C, leads to some inconsistency. So, if you go to the next slide, we can now, I guess, talk about the burden of proof. And the reason why this is important is that giving an argument or proof as to why a doctrine is sufficient, or I'm sorry, as to why a doctrine is consistent is sufficient to justify the position that okay, I should probably have said that. Giving an argument or proof as to why a doctrine is consistent is sufficient to justify the position that the doctrine is consistent. However, it is not necessary. In other words, we don't have to provide a proof, right? It might be sufficient, but it's not necessary for us to provide a proof. The burden of proof is prima facie on the one who is arguing for a doctrine or set of beliefs being inconsistent. So, for example, if I state that naturalism is inconsistent, the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate that. Likewise, the burden of proof is on the anti-Trinitarian to prove that the Trinity and/or incarnation are inconsistent. This point applies to all forms of inconsistency, explicit, formal, and/or implicit. So, if someone wants to claim that something is metaphysically inconsistent, the burden is still on them. In fact, the burden is even greater when it comes to metaphysical inconsistency, because the person alleging a metaphysical inconsistency actually has to provide what the metaphysical laws are. This would require 1, providing some propositions about metaphysics, 2, showing that these propositions are metaphysical laws or metaphysically necessary. So far we've kind of discussed things in like the abstract, I guess you could say, but now we can kind of apply this to like a concrete scenario. So to show that the incarnation is formally consistent, it is sufficient to provide a satisfiable set of sentences that adequately represents the doctrinal commitments of the incarnation. Now, to show that the incarnation is metaphysically consistent, all you have to do is show that the conjunct of the doctrinal commitments and the metaphysically necessary propositions is consistent. However, to show that the incarnation is metaphysically inconsistent, skeptical agnostic or anyone else needs to do the following: 1, explicate the commitments; 2, explicate what the metaphysically necessary principles are; and 3, derive a contradiction from the conjunct. If skeptical agnostic cannot do this, then he's just failed to show that the incarnation is metaphysically inconsistent. Technically speaking, we do not have to prove that the incarnation is consistent because the burden of proof is on him, not us. It might be sufficient to provide a proof, but it's not necessary. All right. Do you want to pause for some questions real quick if we have any other? Because Loki, I'm kind of like my throat kind of getting sore.
I don't
Bro,
see any
parched.
questions other than someone saying or maybe implying that either us or skeptical agnostic are using enticing words. So
Sounds like a, I don't know, nothing burger. I don't know.
Nothing
yeah.
burger.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
and
problem.
simply, you're being a Phil, bro.
Yeah, it's too
Yeah.
much Phil, bro. Me with my cigar in hand, distinguishing all the time.
That's true. All right, so if you want to, let's go to the next slide. So I guess continue if there's no questions.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, does skeptical agnostic meet this burden of proof? When it comes to explicating the commitments of the incarnation, I think he has indirectly met it. However, this is only because he implicitly concedes the explanation I used. Right, and that's because he kind of says, for the most part, the argument I gave is like logically consistent, or that the model I gave is logically consistent, etc. Right. What's important is that he doesn't actually contest the adequacy of it. In other words, when he's covering the argument for formal consistency, he never contests the adequacy of the set of sentences when it comes to representing the commitments. His issue is more so a scope issue, as he thinks that the scope we are talking about is too narrow because we're talking about formal consistency, whereas he wants to talk about metaphysical consistency. And two, although he mentions nitpicks, these nitpicks are metaphysical or theological, right? So he says that the set implies Jesus is omniscient, but the Bible negates that. They're not really about adequacy. In fact, besides that, he seems to be fine with accepting my argument for formal consistency. That is obviously important because the argument for formal consistency, given Branson's methodology, requires the set to be adequate. So, him implicitly conceding adequacy is important here because it means that he is accepting that the account I gave is sufficient to preserve the relevant content. And I think that's important. That's going to come into importance later, right? So, to kind of go to the next slide real quick. So, skeptical agnostic wants to make this an issue of metaphysical consistency, not logical. In other words, formal, right? So, he kind of says they were really concerned with formal consistency, or as he calls it, logical consistency. But then he says, I was trying to get across that metaphysically you can have problems, right? So, he's arguing for a metaphysical inconsistency. Now, that much is fine, but the formalization and explanation I gave pertaining to the formal consistency is still relevant because the questions about metaphysical consistency still involve formal consistency. Remember, for the incarnation to be metaphysically inconsistent, the conjunct of the doctrinal commitments and the metaphysically necessary propositions must be formally inconsistent. In order for him to actually prove that the incarnation is inconsistent, skeptical agnostic still has to prove some form of a formal inconsistency. This is important because he kind of just skips over the large chunk of the video where I explained the methodology, the commitments, and then the regimentation and why that regimentation was adequate. So, to kind of continue on, skeptical agnostic also seems to kind of shift the burden of proof, and he also shifts the goalposts a little bit, right? Because he says that like formulating a logically consistent model is not the whole battle, and he says that well, you need to cash out the metaphysics and you need to cash out the biblical aspect, but the issue is that, well, it's up to him to explain what metaphysically necessary propositions are being violated by the incarnation, right? The burden is on him, not on us, right? And secondly, I think he kind of shifts the goalpost when, like, he says that it the proof of consistency or the argument for consistency doesn't show that the incarnation is consistent with the Bible, right? But that wasn't really the topic of the video. It was more so about logical and metaphysical consistency, not about like whether it's consistent with the Bible. Like that's a different question. Plus, we also answer that question in different videos, so it doesn't really make sense to kind of focus on it in that video. All right, so to continue, skeptical agnostic, I think he makes an error when he says that he wasn't discussing logical consistency, right? And then he says that, oh, showing that something is metaphysically inconsistent shows that it's logically inconsistent. But that's not true. Showing an implicit or metaphysical inconsistency is not the same thing as showing a formal inconsistency. Something can be metaphysically inconsistent whilst being formally consistent, right? Um, all it really needs to be metaphysically inconsistent is that the conjunct between the of the beliefs and the necessary propositions is inconsistent. Um, this is an important distinction to make. So, for example, atheism might be logically inconsistent with some metaphysical viewpoints, but that on its own isn't enough to prove that atheism is logically inconsistent simplicator. Secondly, skeptical agnostic in his initial video did bring up logical incoherence or inconsistency, To be fair, he admits this, but either way, that's still part of his video, so I think it is fair game. Thirdly, we didn't really assume that skeptical agnostic only cared about logical inconsistency, and we kind of explain why on the next slide. So, to kind of elaborate on that third point a bit, we focused so much on logical inconsistency in the first place because we were providing a rebutting defeater to his implicit premise. Remember, his video goes from one, showing a prima facie contradiction, to explaining how Christians argue against the contradiction via an appeal to diaphysis, and then finally it goes to whether diaphysis is incoherent. The reason why we went so heavily into the logical consistency is that the account we gave deals with the LPI without an appeal to diaphysitism. This allows us to deal with steps 1 and 2. The metaphysicism section of our initial video deals with step 2, specifically by showing that just refuting diaphysitism is not enough to refute the incarnation. Then we finally argue against his defense of step 3 by explaining why his argument fails. So, if you want to go to the next slide, we can kind of continue. So the reference to metaphysicism kind of segues nicely into this, because in our video, we brought up metaphysicism to show that even if we granted that diaphysitism is inconsistent, that still doesn't prove that the incarnation is inconsistent. Skeptical Agnostic, however, says that this is just a fringe position. So he says that the Hypostatic Union posits that Jesus has two natures. And then he says that what you're going to notice is that these apologists, they're going to find little corners where it's like you're attacking this view, but there's some Christians who hold this view. They'll kind of just retreat to some fringe view, and it might not be a fringe view, but they'll retreat to a view that kind of runs against what you're trying to refute. So that's what he says, right? So kind of he's saying that metaphysicism is fringe, and that we're kind of like, I guess you could say, kind of retreating to an ad hoc position almost, right? Firstly, I don't think metaphysicism is really fringe, right? Like they're 20% of the entire Christian population, right? Because Oriental Orthodox are metaphysics, and Oriental Orthodox are 20% of the Christian population. In fact, there's like entire nations that are metaphysics. Like Armenia is like 94% Oriental Orthodox, and then Ethiopia is like 40% Oriental Orthodox. And secondly, even if it was fringe, that's not really relevant. Like if you go to the next slide, we kind of explain why I brought up metaphysicism. So to kind of quickly recap, metaphysicism is the position that affirms that the necessary commitments of the incarnation are true, but then also adds on other propositions. Specifically, it states that Jesus has one incarnate nature. Now, whether it's consistent in actuality or like whether it's actually like a good model or whatever you want to argue, that's not really the point of this video. Like that's a separate debate. However, what is important is that you can analyze metaphysics as essentially the conjunct of one, the necessary commitments of the incarnation, and two, the extra metaphysics specific propositions. The reason why this is important is that even if it is fringe, skeptical agnostic still has to prove that metaphysicism is incoherent to prove that the incarnation is incoherent. This is because metaphysicism being incoherent is a necessary condition for the incarnation being inconsistent. This is because if one of the constituents of a conjunct is inconsistent, then the entire conjunct is inconsistent. And via contraposition, if the conjunct is consistent, then none of the components are inconsistent, i.e., they are consistent. So any successful proof for the incarnation being inconsistent would also be a successful proof for metaphysicism being inconsistent. However, skeptical agnostic's argument clearly does not demonstrate that metaphysicism is inconsistent. It also does not demonstrate, like from that, it would follow that it doesn't demonstrate that the incarnation is inconsistent. And if you go to the next slide, you can kind of see why, right? So let's suppose that P is a successful proof against the incarnation, and let the premises in P be represented as S, right? And let the doctrine of the incarnation be represented as I, and metaphysicism as M. Then let's say the extra propositions that metaphysicism adds is E, right? So assuming that the argument is valid, we would know that you can derive the negation of I from S, right? So, and obviously if the proof is successful, then it would be both sound and valid, right? So premises 1 and 2 are just stating that it's 1, valid, and 2, that it's sound, right? Premise 3 is just stating that metaphysicism is logically equivalent to the incarnation in conjunction with the extra metaphysite propositions. And as I said, that's definitional. That's just what metaphysicism is. Then from premise 3, we can derive that a conditional holds between M and I and E. And this just follows via biconditional elimination. Then via conjunction elimination, it would follow that from I and E, you can derive I on its own. And From 4 and 5, via hypothetical syllogism, you can derive that M implies I. However, from 7, you can imply, or I'm sorry, from 1 and 2, you can imply that I is not true. And so from 6 and 7, you can derive that M is not true via modus tollens, right? So notice that if we assume that the proof is sound and valid, then it follows that metaphysicism is inconsistent. That is, any set of premises which is true and 2 implies that the incarnation is false would imply that metaphysicism is also false. So any proof against the incarnation would also be a proof against metaphysicism. However, it's important that this is conditional, right? It's on the condition that the proof is sound and valid, right? But we're not going to grant that. But I'm just saying if it was, it would debunk metaphysicism. But even skeptical agnostic kind of concedes that it doesn't debunk metaphysicism. So it seems to be the case that he hasn't actually debunked the incarnation, right? So now we can get into one of the bigger points of skeptical agnostic's position with natures. So Bustan, you might want to talk on this one.
Really quick, before we do that real fast, 21st century apologetics says, here's the linguistic problem. Is nature a noun or a verb? Hebrew doesn't even have a word for essence nor is, and Greek must reify the verbs. Point being, the incarnation is not a problem. The incarnation only requires this debate in Greek and other Indo-European languages.
This is just like a linguistic point. I don't see why that's relevant to like the metaphysics.
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems kind of weird. But so we see the term nature being thrown around in discussions about the LPT, LPI, etc., right? And it's kind of often opaque because there's different definitions that people don't agree on. So I think it's useful to get clarity, right? Now, in discussions about the LPI or LPT, there's two relevant views of nature that are relevant. There's the historical Aristotelian definition, which would state that a nature is an intrinsic principle of motion or activity from which properties flow. However, in Skeptical Agnostic's response to us and in his video on the LPI, he stated that a nature is a set of essential properties which are necessary for a thing to be the thing which it is. This is a conjunction of a set of properties, and this is a conjunction of a set of properties view and the modal view, kind of. And we'll kind of get into what I mean by that in a bit. Now, as a further point, Skeptical Agnostic actually makes a stronger point that these two views are actually the same. Now, this is false, but we'll return to that later. So for this section, we'll kind of argue that the former definition is superior, both just in general and with respect to the incarnation. So to get started, we can give the scholastic view or the Aristotelian view. So as I said, it's an intrinsic principle of motion or activity. Activity just means operation. Motion just means change. And it is from which certain properties flow. Now, a set of essential properties corresponds to and flows from a nature. However, it is not necessarily the same as a nature. So, some set S is a set of properties of some nature N if and only if it satisfies the following conditions. 1. S is a set of properties. 2. S includes all properties that flow from N. And 3. S only includes properties that flow from N. So, to kind of give the, like I guess you could say, more technical definition from the literature, this is what someone like Phaser writes. And notice that he explicitly denies the set of properties view. He says, the essence of a thing is not a property or cluster of properties. It is rather that from which a thing's properties flow, that which explains its properties. Consider again the traditional Aristotelian definition of man as a rational animal, which, if correct, gives the essence of man. Given this essence, human beings have properties like the capacity for perceptual experience, the capacity for locomotion or self-movement, the ability to form concepts, the ability to reason from one judgment to another in a logical way, and so forth. But rational animality in itself is not the set of or cluster of these properties. Neither is animality the set of cluster of properties like capacity for perceptual experience, etc. Nor rationality the set or cluster of properties like the ability to form concepts, etc. Animality is rather that by virtue of which an animal has the properties in question, right? Rationality that by virtue of which a rational being has its distinctive powers, and rational animality that by virtue of which rational animals specifically have theirs. So to kind of explain, right? Instead of being a set of properties, natures are the things that explain sets of properties, right? So we're trying to explain what the set of properties are when we posit a nature, right? We're trying to explain sort of why objects exhibit unity in terms of their sets of properties.
Yeah, and I think this debate is super relevant whenever you get into things like what is a human. Like even in the practical sphere of political debates, like in abortion debates or like
Right.
euthanasia, and like what constitutes as what is the humanness of someone who's disabled, say for example. So um,
Uh-huh.
just to mention that. So yeah.
So to kind of go further, so this is from Branson. He says that in antiquity, nature didn't mean definition. Aristotle notes that certain things like beds and coats have no innate impulse to change. Whenever they change, something external causes them to change. Other things like plants and animals have within themselves a source of motion and rest, right? Aristotle calls this a nature, defined as a principle or cause of being moved and of being in rest, and in that to which it belongs primarily in virtue of itself and not accidentally. So this isn't a list of properties. It is dynamic. It is something literally powerful, right? Because nature's exert. So, for example, I'm pretty sure Aristotle would have analyzed this in terms of formal causation, right? Because nature's act as a cause. But for Aristotle, he would think that substantial forms are a formal cause, and Bustow might be able to sort of explain that a bit better than me. Is he here?
On the intrinsic aspects of a nature, is that what you want more
Like
specifically?
substantial forms being a formal cause of properties.
Yeah, so when we're talking about quiddity, there's gonna have to be some which thing that's gonna flow from it. So like and things that are gonna flow from it is gonna be stuff like the efficient cause of it. So like when we say, for example, a baseball gets hit by a batter, the efficient cause is gonna be the bat hitting the ball, moving it forward. It's gonna be the exact thing. So yeah.
All right,
Uh,
that's yeah. Okay, that's good enough for now. We'll probably get into that a bit later though, because we've mentioned
mm,
formal causes elsewhere. So at this point, right, it might be a bit confusing, like what a principle is, and this is something that skeptical agnostic kind of brings up, is that he doesn't know what a principle is. Well, this is what the Thomistic philosophy in 4 volumes defines it as. A principle is that from which a thing or in any way proceeds. A thing can proceed from another either as regards to knowledge or as regards reality. Hence, we have the principle of knowledge and the principle of reality. The principle of a thing may be extrinsic as an efficient cause, or it may be intrinsic. Intrinsic principles are of 2 kinds, metaphysical and physical, that is natural. Metaphysical principles, which are common to every genus of being, that is to say,
Yikes. Looks like his internet died, guys. But
oh no, it's over.
yeah.
All right.
So over.
I can probably continue it from here. So
All
where
good.
was yeah, it was at metaphysical principles are principles which are common to every genus of being. That is to say, principles which are constituents of every kind of finite being, namely potency and act. So stuff whenever we talk about movement from one thing to another. Physical or natural principles are principles from which mobile being is first made and constituted. By mobile being, we understand any being that is subject to sensible or corporeal motion.
Mm-hmm. All right, my bad.
So
I don't know what happened there. I think I don't know, bro. Something happened,
yeah,
but anyways. So I hope Bus Sound was able to finish it, but
yeah, I finished
uh,
the quote.
okay, good. So to elaborate, whenever we talk about natures, we are usually talking about a principle in terms of a source of properties. So, for example, with efficient causation, it would be the case that a mother is an efficient cause of her son. In that sense, the mother is a principle. However, with natures, there are principles, but they are not efficient causes, right? And skeptical agnostic kind of asks this, like, is a mother a principle? And me and Bustown kind of had a funny reaction to it. We're like, yeah, a mother is a principle. It's an
We were like,
efficient
yeah,
cause. um, so usually, though, instead of an efficient cause, when it comes to natures of finite beings, they will typically identify, like they want to identify natures of finite beings with substantial forms, and they want to say that substantial forms are formal causes, right? So they want to say nature is a formal cause, and that's why it's a principle. However, this has its merits, but it's not really required for what we're talking about. Like technically, one could just say that the relation between person and nature is a primitive and thus not reducible to causation. So it doesn't have to be formal cause, but that's one way of explicating it. Um, but besides this, in the case of God, we would say that God has a nature in a way that is analogical to creatures. In mobile beings or beings that change, we would say that their motion is sourced in something intrinsic to them which constitutes them. However, in God, his nature just is pure actuality, and there is no potency for a substantial form to actualize. Because in like let's say corporeal beings that change, their matter is in potency, and their substantial form actualizes that potency. Whereas in God, there is no potency, there is no matter, and there is no substantial form that is actualizing said potency. Rather, there is just pure existence. So, if we go to the next slide, this slide is a kind of a wall of text, but given everything we've sort of learned, we can kind of combine this together, right, and see how nature is defined. So, the principle and cause of motion and rest of the thing in which that principle exists fundamentally and essentially, not accidentally. It is called the principle and cause to indicate that in some things nature is a passive principle, and in others it is an active principle, i.e., positive principle, not merely a negative principle, and thus it is a cause. We may also say that that substantial nature with which we are dealing at present is thus distinguished from privation and from the power of operation. Privation is a principle, but not a cause. The power of operation, which is an accident, is a cause, but is not a radical or fundamental principle of operation. Therefore, nature is called a principle and cause so that it may be conceived as a positive principle which causes motion, and thus is distinct from privation, and as the first root or source of motion, and thus it is distinct from the power of operation. Power of operation, yeah. Now, two, of motion and rest, that is to say, of motion or of rest, not of motion and of rest at the same time. Motion here signifies not merely local motion, but any physical or corporeal motion, so change. Rest does not signify the absolute lack of motion, which is nothing, but the lack of motion with the possession of a term which is attained by motion. Thirdly, of the thing in which that principle exists, inasmuch as nature is the intrinsic principle of the thing in motion. Thus, three things are excluded from the notion of nature. A, artificial things are excluded. Their motion does not originate in a form or intrinsic principle, but in art, which is extrinsic to their nature, or which is extrinsic to nature. B, the product of violence is excluded. It is sometimes which originates in some extrinsic power. Excluded too is the efficient causality of a motion of an extrinsic thing, as when fire heats something outside itself, or when an animal engenders another animal. For although the actions by which the fire heats something outside of itself and an animal engenders another animal are natural, inasmuch they result from nature or are destined for propagation of nature, nevertheless nature is formally constituted not with reference to the action, but with reference to the motion which takes place in that in which nature resides. 4, fundamentally or first, thus it is excluded a secondary and instrumental principle of motion, which is accident. Nature is a substance, and therefore the first and radical principle of motion. And 5th, essentially and not accidentally. Thus it is excluded any intrinsic principle of motion which is accidentally united to the subject of motion, as for example when a doctor cures himself. The doctor is restored to health by a principle found intrinsically in himself. Nevertheless, a doctor who is cured by himself is a sick man. And when a doctor cures himself, the sick man is a doctor accidentally. Hence, a doctor is not said to be cured by nature, but by the art that he has within himself, just as other sick persons who are cured by a doctor are cured by art. So, to kind of continue on, right, they also kind of explain what things are natures, right? So they give some examples. So they give the example of first matter, but since first matter does not exist except by means of form, the formality of nature is also proper to form. But moreover, the formality of nature more properly belongs to form than to matter, right? And it kind of gets into what I was talking about earlier with how substantial forms actualize potency in matter. The second one they give is with living being. The formality of nature is proper to the substantial form. As I said, substantial form would actualize the potency in matter because matter is in potency until it's actualized by some substantial form. So with D would be another definition or another case of this would be the rational soul, even as rational, is properly a nature because as such it is the formal constituent of man, who is a natural being, corporeal, subject to corporeal mobility. And one thing to remember is that the rational soul is the substantial form of a man. So that's why they might consider it a nature. However, the sort of final definition they give is a substantial compound as a whole, if understood as subsisting, i.e., as mobile building, is not a nature, but results from nature, that is, from matter and form. But if a compound is understood as a complete principle by which mobile being, as humanity in regard to a man, it may properly be called a nature, right? Now, to kind of apply this to our case with the incarnation, the most appropriate definitions would be D and E. For D, this is relevant because humans have souls, which serves as their substantial form. With E, however, we would say that Christ has a body and soul which are united in time, and this composite would serve as a principle from which certain predicates flow. In other words, certain predications are true of Christ in virtue of this composite being communicable to the person. However, we would qualify this by saying that Christ is not a mobile being, properly speaking, but rather undergoes Cambridge change. So Christ does not intrinsically change, and this is something that Lamb will cover later with supervenience. Likewise, the divinity would be a nature by analogy, as explained prior. So this also answers like skeptical agnostics questions about how a body-soul composite can be a nature. As to the question about how a human nature is not a person, we already have a video covering that extensively, so viewers can look at that. It might be useful to actually pull that up. It's
right.
it's on my channel. It's called like LPI refuted metaphysics Mike something something, I don't know.
LPI refuted. The incarnation is logical. Metaphysics Mike debunked.
Yeah, that one. So
Right.
at the end we go over that question in depth. So if you want to check that out, go for that. You might want to display it on stream so they can at least see the
Yeah. Give me a sec. That. Share screen. I'm just gonna do the whole thing. Here it is. This one, right? The incarnation is logical. Metaphysics Mike debunked. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So this is
So
the
we
video
talked about
y'all want to go to. So
Yeah, if you wanna talk about that, we also go into
Yeah.
what a nature is there, like in
I'll also
relation
drop
to
it in
Christ.
the comments
Yeah.
here. Here it is.
So once we get back to the slides, we can kind of go into the next point. I think Bust Down might also you might want to give some like words on this. He'll understand why. Go to slide 50. So kind of what we have gone into is that like a nature is a principle, and we've given some examples, right? However, and this will be important later, it might be useful to explain that a universal exists in multiple modes of existence. And this will be important on as Aristotle was a moderate realist. And this is kind of in contrast to a Platonist and nominalist view, right? So the Platonist view is that there are forms which exist independently and outside of particulars which instantiate them, right? So their view of universals is that they're sort of independent of their particulars, right? So kind of imagine a statue of David and then two painters who are painting that statue. The paintings represent the statue, but the statue is something extrinsic to the painting, and the form is copied by the painters. Each is a lesser instance of the statue on a lower plane. For Plato, particular things that exist in our lesser plane, which instantiate these concepts, and the concepts are on a higher plane. So for the Platonists, right, that's how they would analyze properties. However, for let's say a moderate realist, they want to say that properties exist in the objects, right? They're immanent in the objects. So, like for example, if you have a pin cushion with pins on it, the pins are something that are in the cushion but still distinct from it in a way, right? They exist in the cushion, but they're not the same as the cushion. The cushion might represent the particular thing, and the pins represent properties. When you say that the thing, let's say you say the thing is red, you would imply that there's some property of redness inhering in the subject, like how pins are in the cushion. Now, in creatures, the properties would be really distinct from them, but still be intrinsic, and thus the properties would compose said creatures. However, with God, the properties are not really distinct from him, and thus do not compose him. Now, unlike moderate realists, however, and Platonists as well, the nominalist would likely state that universals do not exist or have positive ontology in the sense that a moderate realist or a Platonist would give them. So there are, like under this view, there's no pins and there's no statue, kind of, if you want to put it that way. So this is important because it kind of plays into how Thomists and Aristotelians in general conceive of universals, right? Because as sort of Madden explains, the Thomistic holomorphist is operating under the assumption of realism. that there is an objective ground for universal content of thoughts. That objective ground, for example, the universal entity of but that's a hard word to say, honestly. Tortoiseness must either exist as a universal extramentally or in the intellect. If we find the extramental existence of universals, as do Thomas Hylomorphus, then the sole option is to say that the objective ground of universal content exists as universal only in the intellect, which seems to be enough to support the Thomistic thesis that the intelligible aspect of thought involves a separable, non-physical process. The Thomist is not claiming, however, that universal content is merely subjective because universals exist only in the intellect. Rather, the claim is that the nature of tortoiseness is capable of two distinct modes of existence, as a universal in the intellect and as a particular when acting as the form of an individual tortoise. Bustan, you might want to sort of explain more on this to talk about it.
Sorry about that. What? I
Um,
was reading
with how
something.
sort of universals exist in two modes, according to Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, so universals could truly exist in two modes, but when we talk about the like universals in particulars, we usually think of them within like oneself or like within um how should I put this?
In a trope or a mode,
Yeah.
right? Like they're kind of divided up into their objects, right? So kind of
Yeah.
Oderberg describes this, right? It's kind of like a like as possessed by a substance, a substantial form is particular, not universal. It's
Mm,
concrete, not abstract. But you know, consider in thought or like by the intellect, it would be considered immaterial. Like so, considered
yeah.
abstractly, it would be immaterial and a universal instantiated by multiple. But as it exists in the mode of or immanently in the substance, it's particularized.
Yeah. So you could
Right.
say per universal, when you think of a rational man, like you could just think of like any rational man. That's just like a genera or genus of how you think of like a person, right? But when we say something like Roy, you're actualizing. You could say like actualizing that sort of abstract thought into something that is more concrete, and so then we call it like a particular
Right.
nature or like
Uh
particular
huh.
essence.
Right.
Now, for like say with God, right? We don't say that like um for an example of like why there could be like exceptions to this. With God, we don't think of him within a genus, right?
Yeah,
St. Thomas
because he doesn't
explicitly
have
says
a
that.
right. Like properly speaking, we wouldn't say that God is like God isn't a like a composite of matter and form with like actual universal, right? Like it would be analogical.
Yeah. Um the term that like people like St. Robert Bellarmine and Jean-Baptiste Gonnet say is they call it like a quasi universal,
Right.
where like
Which is
the one divine nature is still applied to all three persons of the Godhead.
mhm. Right. So it's analogically a universal, and this kind of
Mm,
plays into actually what Saint Augustine says. If you look at the recent video we did on Gregory of Nyssa, sort of the idea that Saint Augustine had is that universals were kind of like divided up into multiple modes or tropes in their created instance. So, like if you had a like substantial form of being human, right? That would be divided up into multiple humans. So that's why we have multiple souls, right? So as it exists in me and as it exists in Bustdown, we both have numerically distinct substantial forms or souls, right? However, in the divinity, there is no such division, right? Because the divine nature is undivided. There's no potency to actualize there.
yeah.
So we can kind of continue on, right? And then so Branson after this he kind of makes the same point about how like the nature trope is kind of divided, right? So like when like a mother has a child, there's two sort of modes there, right? Because it exists in the mother, but then it also exists in the child, right? However, they're still homoousious because they still share the same species, right? And likewise, their commonality or the the fact that they both have the same like substantial form would ground or explain that they have the same causal powers or motion. So now that we've explained the sort of scholastic view, we can now move on to the set of properties view. Next slide. Okay. So the set of properties view would just be that, like, for any object S, the nature of S or N is the set of all properties necessary to be the thing that S is. Now, one interpretation of this would be that N is the set of all properties such that S exemplifies, S exemplifies that property in every single world, right? So, maybe like if a property is exemplified by S in every possible world, then it's an essential property, right?
You muted yourself again.
Oy vey.
This is when you can tell someone entered his room.
My door is always locked, bro. Anyways, another interpretation would be to say that, like, if S is part of some natural kind, then S's nature would be the set of all properties which are necessary to be in that kind. In other words, if there is some kind K and S is in K, then the nature of S would be the set of properties that are necessary for membership in K, right? So this is a qualified, like, modal interpretation, as it kind of introduces a notion of natural kinds, right? So one of these is a purely modal interpretation where like a property is essential if it's necessary and there's nothing else to it. Whereas another one, you qualify it by adding this sort of notion of kinds. So this view is actually found like in contemporary discussions about like metaphysics and how it relates to the incarnation or Trinity. So skeptical agnostic uses this view. So um, although Paul doesn't hold to this view, he does give sort of a definition, right? So he this is his modal view, or the modal view that he's giving, right? So O is F essentially if and only if O is F, and O does not lack F in any possible world. So it's a modal understanding because you're using sort of modal terms to hash it out, right? Because you're talking about possibility and necessity. So likewise, as I said, skeptical agnostic kind of uses this understanding, and he gives the following example, right? So he kind of gives an example of like a tree that undergoes photosynthesis, but it's deciduous, and he says that the tree is accidentally deciduous and essentially it photosynthesizes. Now, I actually think this is kind of problematic. Obviously, under an Aristotelian view, trees would fall under a like certain species, and due to their nature, which is part of being which is obviously going to be part of being in that species, they would have the property of being deciduous, so it would still be essential. Under a qualified modal view, being deciduous would be implied by being in some natural kind, and thus be part of the essential properties. Now, maybe skeptical agnostic could get around this by saying that holding to a purely modal view and saying that like a deciduous tree could have been non-deciduous. However, I think that will be problematic later down the line as it kind of leads to later problems. So, like for example, although the set of properties view has a lot of issues, which we'll get to, the purely modal view is especially problematic because it kind of leads to everything having its own nature and nothing being like consubstantial. But if you go to the okay, you're already on this slide. But so now we can kind of cover what is called the unity problem, right? And this kind of gets into like why would you posit a nature in the first place, right? Well, as Branson explains, right, most humans have certain causal powers, right? Is this just a coincidence? Like, are powers being divided up at random? Like, what's going on here, right? Is it just a convention? Well, the thing is that there's also another point is that whenever a human lacks one of these powers, say for example someone can't see, there's always a cause that's like prohibiting it, right? Like a person's eye were damaged, maybe they have a genetic disorder, etc., right? And it's kind of unlikely that all of these characteristic powers of human beings just happen to clump together, right? Just by chance. And so kind of there must be something to unify and thereby explain the patterns of distribution of causal powers that we see among organisms. That's what natures are for. The nature is the principle from which those causal powers flow. And then likewise, Phaser, if you go to the next slide, it's 58. Phaser gives sort of the same argument that like the world is just the way we would expect it to be if like real essences existed, right? Like if sort of a realist view, specifically a moderate realist view of essences were true, then the world is exactly how we would expect it to be under that view. So, like for example, individual objects within a kind share unity with each other, which they do not share with other individuals in a kind, right? And likewise, things have individual unity in themselves. And this is unexpected under like competing hypotheses. So to kind of finish this off before we go to skeptical agnostic's response, go to the next. We're on it's 59. Yeah. So to finish this off, one thing that Phaser points out is that the essence must be distinct from its properties for several reasons. One reason is that treating an essence as a set of properties is as problematic as treating a substance as a cluster of accidents, right? So it doesn't make sense to hold to bundle theory for similar reasons. And this is called a unity problem. If an essence is a set of properties, then what is it that makes it the case that all and only the properties that make up a certain kind of thing's essence occur together in that kind of thing? It might seem that this could be explained by appealing to the laws of nature. It is just a law that all and only such and such properties are always found together in this kind of thing. But Phaser points out that's problematic because laws are really descriptive, right? They're just shorthand descriptions of how things operates given its essence. So that doesn't seem to work. However, we should kind of continue. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see Skeptical Agnostic actually does give a response to this. So kind of what he says is that he agrees that something needs to unify the properties, and then he says the set is what unifies the properties. He says the set is a unifying principle. So one argument he gives is kind of weird. It's like if you picture a set, you would picture like a circle containing the set, and like the circle is like a unifying element there. So that's one argument he uses. I think this is kind of a strange sort of argument to use because, well, the circle is just like a visual sort of representation. It's just meant to be like there to help teach set theory. It's not meant to assert anything like substantive metaphysically. Another argument he gives is that like you can have an empty set, but you can't have elements without a set. So therefore sets are more fundamental, which is kind of like what this whole argument here relies on. He's kind of assuming that, or arguing for, or kind of presupposing that sets are more fundamental, and so therefore they can serve as like a principle of unity because they're more fundamental than their elements. But his argument here is a non sequitur, and we'll kind of cover why that is below. The obvious issue with saying that sets are prior to their elements and that they explain them is that a set just in general isn't going to be a good unifying principle or like a truth maker, right? Because we want to say that truth supervenes on being, and that specifically the truth about a thing is grounded in that thing, right? Typically speaking, unless maybe it's like some form of a Cambridge change, at which point you could have an exception, but that's not the norm. And there's no reason to think this is an exception. Now, the truth that there is unity amongst these objects in terms of their properties, causal powers, etc., should be grounded in the being, not in the abstract sets. So, we managed to do that by positing these substantial forms, which are in the beings themselves, right? So we can easily sort of deal with that. Whereas I don't see how these set of properties, if you can deal with that, because sets aren't immanent universal. Like they're not immanent at all. In fact, I would say. In fact, he kind of recognizes this because he kind of brings up this idea of like a set is abstract, and presumably we wouldn't want an abstract entity to kind of be like an explanation or like causal principle for this kind of thing. He just kind of asserts and does like a tu quoque argument and says that like, okay, well, Thomists also have that problem, but the issue is that we don't. And we kind of went into this with, and this is why like I went into like substantial forms and how they're concretized or like particularized in their like beings that they're in. As we kind of explained, substantial forms or natures are immanent in their like substances, and so they exist particularly or concretely in their substances. So sets are like purely abstract and not immanent, whereas you don't have that problem with a substantial form or a nature, right? As a further point, set membership doesn't even require a unifying principle. It doesn't imply either, right? So let's say you have a set with that tree, this dog, and those shoes. That's a set. Yet there's no unity. There's no relevant sense of unity, at least, right? So
Or like
set
the number
membership-
5 and camera. Like what's you can put those two into a set, but what kind of unifying like principle
there's
is
none.
there to ground that, So I think this is a really key point whenever
Right, there's no-
discussing. Yeah.
And on top of that, right, the set of properties is the thing that we need to explain. Appealing to the set would seem circular, right? kind of like to give an example, right? So I put 3 on here, but let's just say there's 4 people on stream, right? Then suppose suppose I needed an explanation. Why are there exactly 4 people on stream? And someone came up to me and said, well, the set of people on stream has a cardinality of 4. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. That's like a nothing burger answer. Like I didn't learn anything from that, basically. Like it's clearly obvious that they just didn't answer the question in the intended way. He didn't actually give a sufficient principle or explanation. Likewise, like trying to account for unity just by appealing to a set of properties doesn't actually explain anything. So to kind of continue on this train of thought, just in general, sets are not more fundamental than their elements, right? So take the following example: the set of all people named Socrates. Imagine if you asked me for the explanation behind Socrates of Athens being named Socrates. Then suppose I responded by saying, oh, well, Socrates is named Socrates because he's an element of the set of people named Socrates. Well, does this actually tell you anything? Well, no, it seems not, right? Like, telling me that he's part of the set doesn't actually provide a satisfactory answer. But compare this to the opposite scenario. Like, let's say that I'm asking you, why is the Athenian philosopher in the set of all individuals named Socrates? And then suppose I responded, well, because his name is Socrates. Now that one actually makes sense, right? And the reason why it makes sense is because elements are prior to their sets in terms of like ontological grounding. So kind of put it another way, claiming that Socrates is called Socrates because he is in the set of individuals called Socrates is not an adequate explanation. Whereas the statement, the Athenian philosopher is in the set because his name is Socrates, is adequate. Now, if sets were prior to their elements, then this is highly unexpected. To give another example of this, so this is from Sijawade's paper. He gives the example of, let's say you have a singleton set that only includes Socrates. Well, this set would exist in virtue of Socrates. And note that regardless of whatever issues you might find with Sijawade's views, he's kind of just describing a very standard example in sort of a grounding views in metaphysics. So, what we're describing here about sets not being more fundamental is kind of just standard for grounding theories. So, next slide, by the way. As mentioned earlier, he kind of brings up a tu quoque argument. Like he just says, okay, well, there's this problem about abstract objects for me, but like it applies to Thomism as well. But I mean, no, like universals have multiple modes of existence, right? And they're immanent. Compare this to like a set, right? Like suppose you have Socrates, Fido the dog, and Roy's phone. That's a set, but it doesn't exist immanently in its elements, and it's not like, I guess you could say, concretized or particularized in its elements either. So overall, I don't think you can solve the unity problem. I think that the attempts to solve it are kind of just failures, if you want me to be honest. So I think that the unity problem is very, very sort of hard to deal with on his end. But the next argument, we can go to our defective instances. Next slide, by the way. Yeah. So this is once again from Phaser, right? And he kind of gives an example of, like, let's say a cat has 4 legs, right? Now, this property seems to be part of being a cat, right? It's essential to being a cat because it would flow from its essence in some way, right? However, a cat lacking 4 legs does not mean it's no longer a cat, right? Because it's an essential property, because 4-leggedness would flow from the essence of a cat, but it could, for example, be defective because something is blocking that property from flowing, right? So kind of one way to think about it is, imagine if you had like a pool of water that flows into a lower pool of water. The water flows from one pool to another, but you could block off that flow and stop it and make the flow defective, right? So, if you have a cat with 4 legs, that having 4 legs would seemingly be part of what a cat is, and yet you can have defective instances. So under the view that we have, where substantial forms sort of explain why things have properties, this makes perfect sense, right? Having a defective instance makes sense under this case, or under this hypothesis. But under a set of properties view, a defective instance doesn't even make any sense at all, right? So when we claim that cats are 4-legged animals, this seems to be a description of their essence or nature, right? We're making, in a way, a general claim about cats and their properties. this is exactly the type of statements where natures are posited to do explanatory work. However, this leads to a dilemma for the modal view. Either being four-legged is actually in the essence of a cat or it isn't. If it isn't the essence of a cat, then a cat that loses its legs is, well, no longer a cat, but that's absurd, right? However, if it's not part of it, then having four legs would not flow from the essence. Both are problematic. The first one is obviously absurd, but the second one is also absurd because there's clearly something about catness implies having four legs, right? Even if it's not like a sort of an entailment, there's clearly something to it, right? Like it's not just a coincidence that cats happen to have four legs. Now, under the view that cats have a substantial form that properties flow from, now that makes perfect sense as to why some cats have three legs even though most have four, whereas the set of properties view can't make much sense of that. Now, the next argument we can cover is the too many natures argument. So to kind of explain this, natures are meant to be a unifying principle, and we want to kind of state that multiple humans share in the same genera or species, meaning they have the same nature. However, this seems hard to preserve on a purely modal understanding of essences or natures, right? Like suppose that a nature is just the set of properties that are necessary for something to be the thing that it is. So if something is human and cannot be otherwise, then it is essentially human. Given this understanding, all properties that are necessary would be part of its natures. However, there seems to be non-essential yet necessary properties. So, for example, suppose there's two persons named John and Mark. Something needs to individuate them from each other. In this case, right, let's say you take, for example, Gregory of Nyssa's view, it would be spatio-temporal discontinuity, or maybe if you want to take a more modern view, you could say it's psychological discontinuity. Either way, right, whichever way you want to say, there's clearly a criteria of individuation here. And, right, what's important is that if something is spatio-temporally continuous with Mark, then that thing just is Mark, right? Because nothing other than Mark can be spatio-temporally continuous with Mark, because that's how we would individuate different persons. And same thing for John, right? If something is spatio-temporally continuous with John, it just is John. However, things can also be individuated across time, right? So Socrates is not the same man as Thomas Aquinas, but they're, right, even though like they exist at different times. However, we can take this further and say that they are individuated across possible worlds. In other words, cross-world identity and distinction exists. So suppose that John and Mark are both 5'11" in the actual world. There's a possible world where Mark is not 5'11", but John is. There's a possible world where both are 6 foot, etc. Yet in each of these worlds, they're still distinct, right? So John in world A is the same person in John in world B, but he's never the same person as Mark. Well, that raises the question: what individuates John from Mark? Likewise, what unifies John in all these possible worlds? Well, spatio-temporal and psychological continuity do not make much sense here, as these are different possible worlds, right? However, suppose that we posited that Mark has some necessary property that suppose that we posited that John has some necessary property that Mark didn't have. That's probably an error on my part, my bad. But anyways, right, suppose that you want to say that the causal history leading up to his conception is one of those properties, right? In other words, it's a property that he has in all possible worlds. That would be sufficient to individuate him from Mark across all possible worlds, right? So if John has some necessary property that Mark does not, that would seem to be sufficient to individuate them across possible worlds, whilst also maintaining cross-world identity. But that implies that they have necessary properties that the other one doesn't have, right? So John has the necessary property that Mark does not have, and vice versa. But given the modal understanding, it would seem that John and Mark, despite both being human, have different natures. But that's not tenable. And in fact, Mark and John are just arbitrary examples. You can literally do this for anyone. So, there's 8 billion humans. So now there's 8 billion natures according to the modal understanding. But that's obviously problematic because, well, you're just talking about, there just wouldn't be a sense in which they're united. Now, to be fair, you could accept like a qualified modal version where like sets of properties that are necessary for kind membership are natures. But this returns back to the unity problem now. Plus, I think that a purely modal understanding is kind of crucial to his argument, to Skeptical Agnostic's argument against the Incarnation. And so rejecting the modal understanding for a qualified version would lead to other costs for his worldview in terms of what arguments he can use against other worldviews. Right, so also plus he kind of like implies that, if you go to the next slide, or actually I think you might be on it, slide 68, he kind of just implies that he's taking a modal view, right? Because he doesn't mention anything about kinds. Like he doesn't insinuate anything about like a kind oriented view, right? It's purely modal as far as I can tell. Plus, as I said before, his argument depends on the union set of human and divine properties being a set of essential properties. However, if we take like a kind-oriented approach to natures, then the union set being one set isn't sufficient to conclude that it is a nature. In fact, it being a set of properties that contains properties which are essential to Jesus isn't even sufficient here. In order to conclude that it is a nature, you would have to add the premise that, well, it's a set that corresponds to some singular kind. But no such premise exists, right? So you would have to posit that some theandric kind exists, or that some God-man kind exists, and that the set of properties corresponds to it. But he never argues that, so I don't see how you can kind of, maintain that whilst also, holding on to his other commitments. So to kind of give the final argument against him in terms of his nature, or in terms of his definition of nature. So far we've covered it in terms of like explanatory virtues and like the epistemology, right? We've given arguments as to why one has more explanatory power. However, right, we also need to explain the sort of we also need to consider the historical and theological perspective, because we are wishing to use these terms as part of a philosophical analysis of theology. This is because regardless of if the scholastic account has more explanatory power, the account is still what the scholastics use, right? So when analyzing a historical document, the terms should be typically understood or interpreted as what they were intended to be by the author. So for example, the term species is used differently in Aristotle than it is today. But when doing an analysis of Aristotle, we interpret species not in the contemporary scientific sense, but in the ancient philosophical sense, because that's what Aristotle meant. Likewise, the claim that water is an element has low explanatory power, yet that does not change the fact that Aristotle conceived of it that way. The same point can be made about nature and how it relates to, for example, the Incarnation. The sources that we just derive Diophysite doctrine, so Chalcedon, would be using something similar or equivalent to the scholastic view, which we kind of went over in the earlier video about how they defined it as a set of, they defined it not as a set of properties, but rather as an intrinsic principle of motion, right? However, the set of properties view is a recent view and is anachronistic when you're trying to, like, if you're trying to analyze the Incarnation or the two natures formula using said view, that seems a bit anachronistic, right? Because that's not what they conceived of it as. To kind of continue on, though, the way that Skeptical Agnostic kind of wants to respond to this is that he actually just says that the two views, scholastic and set of properties view, are just the same, right? So he says that there's a distinction without a difference, right? And once again, we can look at what he says about like this unifying circle thing, and about how he kind of just asserts that a set of properties is a unifying principle. There's sort of a prima facie issue, right? Is that firstly, like, he kind of seems to claim on the one hand that our definition isn't like tenable, or that it has issues, right? Because he kind of says that our definition is flawed, but then at the other time he says that it has the same content, right? Because he says that the definitions are the same. So that seems kind of inconsistent. Like, are both of our definitions like the same in terms of content, or like is one like problematic whereas the other one isn't? I feel like it's kind of weird. He kind of needs to explain what he means by that. But more importantly, right, his two arguments for it, for like the two definitions being the same, just don't work, right? Because as we covered above, his empty set argument is just a non sequitur, right? To kind of explain why, right? When he says that the empty set can exist without elements, what he likely means is that the empty set has no elements within it, and thus, in that sense, it is independent of the elements. However, that does not prove that sets in general are independent of their elements. The empty set clearly isn't some arbitrarily chosen set from which you can generalize. It clearly is a unique example, so much so that it has its own symbol in set theory. In fact, definitionally, they wouldn't, like, other sets wouldn't be independent due to the fact that independence here would just imply like not having elements. But obviously, non-empty sets have elements that compose them, so they wouldn't be independent. Now, perhaps you want to analyze it more so in terms of like ontological grounding. So maybe he's arguing that the empty set is a counterexample to the principle that all sets are grounded in their elements. However, this is just a non sequitur because the principle can just be vacuously true in this instance. To explain, from the principle that all sets in general are grounded in their elements, you could derive that the empty set is grounded in its elements. Now, what Skeptical Agnostic might be saying is that since there are no elements, this set can't be grounded in said elements, right? But this doesn't follow because the derived principle can be vacuously true, right? Because if the set is empty, then it would just be vacuously the case that all elements in that empty set would ground that set, right? So the principle still holds. Either way, even if the empty set was ungrounded, that has literally no implications on whether other non-empty sets are grounded. Remember, when we talk about sets being grounded, we are concerned primarily with sets of objects or properties, specifically ones that are not empty. And another point, to kind of illustrate the invalidity of his inference, it might be useful to give an analogy here, right? Like, assume a room was built in 2026. Anyone in the room is called a member. And anyone who is outside the room is not a member. Now, suppose that John, Bob, and Mark were all born in 2000, and thus all are prior to the room temporally and ontologically. However, all three men are members. So there are three members in the room. However, hypothetically, you could have an empty room. In other words, the room could exist without the members being there, but you cannot have the members without the room. If the room did not exist, there would be no members. Now, would this imply that the room is prior to its members? No, obviously not, because the three members were all born prior to the room's existence. Yet, what is interesting is that this argument is basically it's basically the same in terms of its form or structures as skeptical agnostics. Both have equal justification, and I see no reason for accepting one but rejecting the other. Right. So if one is sound, the other is sound, it seems, because they both have the same backing, in my opinion. So to kind of continue on with the next slide, by the way. Oh wait, is this slide 72, by the way?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So his argument is that because scholastics state that a nature is a principle of motion or activity and unity, therefore they're referring to a set of properties because a set of properties is also a principle of unity. However, this is flawed because it is in his metaphysical system that the set of properties is a principle of unity. The scholastic metaphysical system does not include that, but rather explicitly denies it. His metaphysics might imply that a set of principles is a nature via being a principle of unity, but that doesn't prove that the scholastics thought of it that way. Imagine if, for example, I met an atheist who said that the universe is the fundamental object and is ungrounded. Then I said that because in my metaphysical system, God fits that description of being ungrounded, that therefore the atheist is referring to God and has the same conception of me. This is kind of like what skeptical agnostic is doing, and yet this is clearly like fallacious. He is saying that the scholastics claim that a nature is F, then showing that in his metaphysical paradigm, a set of properties is also F, and then from there concluding that the scholastics meant that the set of properties is a nature. Obviously, this isn't a valid deduction. As a further point, it seems that kind of like the thesis that he has is improbable, right? Just starting out, because the scholastic view has explanatory power where the set of properties view does not, right? And if they were the same view, that's not expected, right? Because two identical hypotheses will never have different explanatory powers. Likewise, the contemporary scholastic authors who have interacted with the set of properties view explicitly deny that this view is adequate to represent the scholastics. If the scholastics actually were in line with the set of properties view, why would their contemporary successors reject this view while citing the scholastics for support? Thirdly, the scholastic view is trying to explain or account for why things share similar or identical sets of natural properties. They are trying to explain why there is a commonality. Appealing to the set of properties to explain the set of properties would be circular. Just overall, I think the scholastics would have rejected both modal views, but they would have especially rejected the purely modal view for the reasons that I mentioned above with the too many natures argument. So now, given the definition of sort of nature, we can kind of see where skeptical agnostic went wrong. So skeptical agnostic used this argument shown here in his original video. And the way that I reconstructed it is, if you go to the next slide, I give the following reconstruction where, it's on slide 76, by the way, where for context, like A is the set of divine properties, B is the set of human properties, and the union set of A and B would be the set containing both, right? However, according to him, I should explain. According to me, this is a non sequitur. But according to him, I only think this because it's actually a misrepresentation. So if you go to the next slide, you'll kind of see what he says. But the issue is that he only contests that premise 3 is an inadequate representation, right? Because when it comes to premise 1, he accepts it explicitly, and then he reads out premise 2, but then doesn't dispute it. And it seems that he accepts it given the tone he has, right? So really, his only contention is with premise 3. So as far as I can tell, my argument did adequately represent him, except for that one fact that I missed a one word in one premise, right? Because his issue is that I didn't include the word all in premise 3. But it's not that big of a deal. You can easily just add that in, right? And we can make the same points we made before, right? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that this is all I did is add the word all back in, and now we have according to him, supposedly what this would be, what his argument is, right? Now to deal with this argument, we can just deny 4. We can reject 2 hypothetically, right? Um, and we would just say that 3 does not follow, right? We defined this earlier, but under our definition, it definitely would not follow, right? Because a set of properties that, in order to be an essential set of properties, it would have to flow from a nature, right? A set of properties having all properties that are essential does not inherently meet that criteria. And on top of that, the argument itself never defines the criteria for being the set of essential properties, right? It only
I was
says
gonna
that
bring that
something.
up. Like, just
Yeah.
because all humans that we've observed before are under 20 feet doesn't mean that it's somehow like intrinsic to human nature. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Right. It seems that kind of he is assuming that a set containing all properties that are essential to Jesus means that it is the set of essential properties, right? Or the set of all essential properties. Those are an equivalent, right? Even ignoring the definition we gave, no premise makes an equivalence between the two, and thus the argument is invalid. If he wants to add this assumption as a premise, then, well, firstly, he'd have to do that, and secondly, we could deny that, right? Now, to go down, sort of in my initial response to Skeptical Agnostic, after I sort of explained why I think his definition is bad, I sort of modified the argument using the proper definitions, right? In other words, I'm kind of showing what you would have to modify his argument if Skeptical Agnostic used the proper definitions, but then he still kind of wanted to keep the core of his argument, right? The reason why this is important is that even if we grant that his argument is valid given his definitions or semantics, that wouldn't amount to much since he is using definitions that are wrong. Now, to be fair, he does try and get around this earlier in the stream by arguing that the definitions we gave are equivalent to his. But as we have seen, the argument does not work because it is a non sequitur, and the two views are clearly distinguishable given that they have different explanatory power. However, to be fair, right? Also, by the way, so with the modified argument, you can clearly see that questions 3 and 4 are just blatantly question begging and don't work, right? However, to be fair, Skeptical Agnostic does give another argument to seemingly try and prove that premises 3 and 4 are true, right? And he presents this in a form of a dilemma, right? So if you go to the next slide, you can see what he explicitly says, right? So kind of what he's asking, if you want to go to the next slide, I kind of summarize it there. He's basically trying to provide a dilemma for us, right? He's saying that Jesus has human properties and divine properties, and that let's say we label that set with H and D, right? Then Jesus exemplifies all properties in the union set of D and H. And so he gives this dilemma. Either 1, there is no principle from which the properties in the union set flow, or 2, there is a principle from which the set of properties flows. However, I think this is a false dichotomy, right? Because we can give a third option. There are 2 principles from which the properties flow. In other words, both natures allow Jesus to have the set of properties, right? Furthermore, I don't think he actually gave like a sufficient argument here because when talking about the first option that there's no principle, he doesn't actually draw out any substantive implications. He kind of just gives a question, but questions aren't arguments, right? It's more so just a question, right? And really, his question, like even if you want to say there's an implicit argument, really all he's saying is that, oh, okay, if you're saying there's no principle, then like what you're saying is that positing natures doesn't have any explanatory power. So what's the point of positing them? But we could concede that natures have no explanatory power, but like that doesn't prove that the incarnation is inconsistent. So I don't see how this dilemma does anything for him, right? Because it kind of just makes an epistemic point about explanatory virtues. It never actually gets to the incoherence part. All right, so I'm gonna kick it off by kind of bust down now because he wants to talk about this.
Yeah, so this was one of the bits that we unfortunately had to cut out before. So in his last prior, like the first time he did the video, was that he kind of implied that the natures would collapse into one nature, or you could think of like again 2 sets collapsing into one, in his words. But Johannes Wiggers, who was a 17th century theologian of the Roman Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformational age, wrote a commentary on Tertia Pars, which is the section of the Summa Theologica from St. Thomas on Christology. And this is what he writes, specifically in those who argue that the two natures would actually collapse into one. Whenever the question was asked whether the union of the incarnate word took place in the nature. When he's saying in the nature, they mean the divine nature. So Johannes Wiggers writes, quote, nor though the union of the incarnate word with the nature, it did come that from the divine nature and the human nature, each remaining in its own formal being, so each of their own formal existence, there resulted one complete third nature in a way that that from matter and form a composite of one nature results naturally. This is certain. It is proven that the human and divine natures are not partial and imperfect entities ordered to composing one perfect nature. Rather, they are integral, complete, and perfect entities. Therefore, from them, in the manner described, one nature cannot be constituted. This is confirmed because such a composition cannot be conceived except by imagining of the divine and human natures as substantial parts of one nature, whether concurring in the manner of essential parts, namely matter and form, and in the matter of integral parts, but neither can take place and not in the latter, because integral parts must then be quantified, which is foreign to the divine nature, nor the former, because it is repugnant not only to the most complete form of the divine nature, to have the character of a part and to cause material informity on account of the imperfection of which these modes of causing bring with them, but it is also repugnant to the human nature, which the judgment of all philosophers considered a nature, is a perfect being in no way ordered to constituting another complete nature, therefore, etc. So basically what he's trying to say is it couldn't possibly be that the union takes place within either the divine nature or the human nature on their own, or even compositing into one nature, because the divine nature cannot be properly quantified in the way whenever we discuss the union, right, into parts. So like when we talk about, say, like divisions in the divine nature, like you can't say that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three different parts of the one divine essence, because then we'd be dividing God, and then he wouldn't properly be considered one God or of one essence. So obviously that's where it falls apart and is repugnant to our position. And then the reason why it's also repugnant for the human side is that because then it's not going to be properly considered a nature, because you're saying then there's no like complete perfection or like no completion aspect of the human nature on its own when it is properly complete. So whenever we talk about this is also brought up in another aspect in the Tertia Pars. So although this is a little bit tangential, there's something called like the Severan dilemma on whether natures in particular, whether the human natures or just the natures of Christ are particular or universal. St. Thomas brings up the answer of that, similar to how a hand is a particularized nature within like the human body. You could say there's like there's a nature within like your hand, but the nature of the hand is contained in something that is more perfect, that is an arm, than something more perfect, a whole human body. So the reason why he's saying this is repugnant is because you're then lacking that completeness if you're saying it's a composite of uh, the human and divine aspects.
All right, yo, I'm back. Wait, did I come back like right as you were finishing supervenience?
No, he just finished
Oh, okay.
the nature collapse refuted.
Yeah, well, I might as well get the modal collapse thing out of the way then, since I'm back for a bit. So, this is what reason why I'm calling it modal collapse kind of is that it's kind of as so what skeptical agnostic is arguing here is that my sort of commitments would entail that like humans are necessary, which is like a quasi modal collapse in a way, because it entails that things which we would expect to be contingent are actually necessary and so forth, right? However, I don't think that this argument works. I think it's a non sequitur because this is what I said, right? Contingency and ignorance are common properties. They are not essential. So something which has a human nature can be necessary and omniscient. It just isn't common. According to Skeptical Agnostic, I am promoting S5 modal logic. But in S5, if something is possibly necessary, it is necessary simplicator. Thus, all humans are necessary. But this is just a non sequitur. To put it simply, I did not say that all humans are possibly necessary. Neither did I say that human nature itself is necessary. What I said was that it is possible that there exists some supposit with a human nature such that this person is necessary. The former claim is necessary to derive that all humans are necessary beings given S5, specifically given the axiom that he's citing, right? Because he's going from possibly necessary to necessary, right? So the claim that all humans are possibly necessary, that's what he actually needs to get his conclusion. But I never claimed that, right? But the thing that I did claim is not sufficient to get his conclusion. To kind of explain it further, he's equating between a statement in a natural language and a formula within the formal language, right? Because the S5 axiom that he's referring to would be that for any formula P, if possibly necessary P, then you can derive necessarily P, or possibly necessary P implies P and necessarily P. Likewise, if you're using like a quantified modal logic like we are, you can derive necessarily x is d from possibly necessarily x is d, where d is some predicate, right? So, given this axiom, if my claim was that for all x, if x is h, then x is possibly necessarily d, then it would follow that all humans are necessary beings given the interpretation that I gave to those predicates. However, that's not what I claimed, right? Like skeptical agnostic just cannot derive that like if I didn't claim that, if he's trying to use that specific axiom, right? Because in order to derive that using that specific axiom, he needs to have that particular claim. But I never said that, right? But I said that some human is possibly necessary, right? So, if you wanted to formalize that, you would have to say possibly there exists some x, such as x is h and x is necessarily d, right? So this does not entail that all humans are necessary beings, right? So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll see like so right here, right, you see a counter model where on the left, what we have is the formula that I'm affirming, that being that there exists something which is like possibly uh, both human and necessarily D, right? So on the left, it says that possibly there exists something which is X, such that X is H and X is necessarily D. Whereas on the right, it says that for all X, if X is H, then X is necessarily D. What you'll notice is that the formula that I affirm is not the same thing as the formula, or I'm sorry, it does not entail the formula that skeptical agnostic wants to derive. And so therefore, skeptical agnostic's argument is a non sequitur because this would just be an invalid deduction. To kind of further, I guess you could say, emphasize this point, we can just look at the formalization I gave, and you can see that the formalization I gave, or the set of sentences I gave, does not entail that all humans are necessary beings. So once again, still an invalid deduction. And if we want to go even further, we can point out that if you look at the next slide, from the it's, slide 88, by the way. Right. Okay. So kind of further nail the point in, you can actually derive my claim that a person with a human nature is possibly necessary, and that's going to be implied by the formula itself, whilst the claim that all humans are necessary is not implied, showing that the former does not entail the latter. So, like, to further kind of go on to this, the 14th statement says that Jesus is like a necessary being, or you could derive that Jesus is a necessary being or the necessary being from the 14th and 28th statement. But from there, one could derive that Jesus is the necessary being and Jesus is human from Formula 15 via conjunction introduction. Then, via existential introduction, one could derive that there exists something which is human and a necessary being. But since actuality implies possibility, one could derive that it is possible that something is both human and necessarily divine. In other words, one could derive that something can be human and still be the necessary being, right? So no, my view does not entail some form of modal collapse. And if we to kind of give an analogy, because I know it might be kind of sort of, I guess you could say, difficult to kind of see what I'm getting at. If you go to the next slide, I think this should really help illustrate it. So let's say I say that some f is g, right? The statement is most adequately formalized as saying that there exists some f such that, there exists some x such that x is f and x is g. This is because of the fact that the sentence merely requires the existence of one thing, which is both f and g. However, this is different from the claim that all f's are g's. This statement would be most adequately formalized with for all x, if x is f, then x is g, right? This is because the statement implies that if something is in the category F, it must also be in the category G. So, for example, the first sentence allows for there to be an F, which is not G, whereas the second sentence does not allow for this. So, if I tell you that some human is tall, that does not imply that all humans are tall. Likewise, if I say it is possible that some human is born on July 1st, it wouldn't follow that all humans are possibly born on July 1st. And I think Skeptical Agnostic's mistake here is that he's interpreting some F as G as if it would be equivalent to all F's are G. Without that interpretation, his argument just falls apart. Yet this interpretation is obviously flawed, right? Remember, I said that something can be both human and necessary, not that all things which are human are also necessary. For a skeptical agnostic's deduction to work, he needs to have the second sentence, but I never stated that. Now, at this point, right, maybe I'm surprised he didn't really mention this, because if I wanted to argue modal collapse against this type of sort of viewpoint, I would probably use this, right? Because under the system I'm using, there's actually a fixed domain, which means the domain of objects stays sort of constant across possible worlds, right? And maybe you can argue that even though it's formally consistent, it's like a metaphysically necessary rule that some objects only contingently exist, right? So the set of objects in this world is not fixed across worlds. However, even if skeptical agnostic does decide to argue this, I don't think this works, because you could just remove the fixed domains and you would get a consistent theory. In fact, the set of sentences being consistent in a language that has S5 axioms with the fixed domains would imply that the set is also consistent in a language with S5 axioms and a non-fixed domain, because removing rigid designation and fixed domains doesn't add any new axioms or inference rules. It removes or restricts them. So, in a sense, having a fixed domain leads to a so-called like stronger language or system, right? Because to kind of give an analogy, if we constructed a formal language similar to propositional logic, but without the law of excluded middle, so intuitionist logic, for example, all consistent sets of sentences in propositional logic would still be consistent in the system, because the system is weaker than propositional logic. So, for example, all provable formulas in intuitionist logic are provable in propositional logic, but not vice versa. Hence, if something is not provable in propositional logic, it is not provable in intuitionist logic. So, right, what we would see is that even if you want to bring up this worry about rigid designation and fixed domains, it wouldn't matter, because we can remove that and the theory would still be consistent. All right, I guess there's one last like miscellaneous thing we could cover. If you go to the next slide, before we get to like supervenience. So he kind of like asks at certain time like whether or not certain properties are accidental or essential. The issue is that he kind of like skips the part. If you go to the next slide, he kind of skips the parts where I explain what the properties are, how they work, etc. Because he kind of just asks the question of like, what does it mean to say that Jesus has human properties and divine properties? But I kind of already explained what it means to say that. But he just skips over that portion of the video. Secondly, the formalization doesn't have to explicitly answer the question of whether the properties are accidental or essential. Even if we're talking about implicit or metaphysical consistency, the burden is still on him to prove that the doctrinal commitments contradict the metaphysical principles. So, if he wants to claim that there's a problem with respect to whether predicates are essential or accidental, he would have to demonstrate that a contradiction follows from the conjunction of that principle with, like, the formalization, for example, right? But he hasn't done that. Thirdly, right, the accidental versus essential distinction has to do with properties in the metaphysical sense. The formalization, however, is applying predicates in the sense that they're used in a formal language. Unless we're using like a modal understanding, which see below for that, there's no reason to suggest that every property in a formal language must be explicitly accidental or essential. So, if we take a modal understanding, which I think that's what he's doing, the claim that all properties are accidental or essential is already implied by the theory. So I don't need to include it explicitly because it's already implied by the system itself, right? And that's important, right? Because obviously, if it's implicit in the system itself, then the theory would not be able to be consistent if it contradicted the claim that all properties are accidental or essential. Although, remember, this is using his semantics to explain what essential and accidental are, right? Because he's using a modal understanding. As to the next slide, that kind of just shows. So this kind of just shows that, like, how do I put it? Like, it shows that if you take a modal understanding of, in essence, and accidental properties, the claim that if a being has some property F, then either that property is accidental or essential, just is valid within the system we're working in. And notice you could replace F with like anything else, and it would still be valid, meaning that it's just part of the system itself, almost. Or I'm sorry, I should say that it's implied by the axioms within the system. I think okay. Wait. How much more content do we have to get through? Because I'm kind of speeding through this because we've been going on for like 2 hours.
Yeah, we're
got
2 hours
another,
and
like,
15 minutes in.
15
We
we
wanted
got,
to do like
another
a
15 slides in.
okay. We wanted to do like a 2-hour 30-minute stream, right?
Yeah, I
I
think so.
can blitz through like the other theologians if you want. I can do common and essential, and then like the last theology objection at the end.
Well, I mean, I can read it
Oh.
out. It's just that I don't know if we want to do it for like this long, right?
I think we could probably finish it out. I don't think it would
Yeah, I
take
think we
Okay.
can
more
finish
than
it
like
out.
20 minutes.
We've
Okay.
even done like 3-hour streams before, so
That's true. Yeah. Okay. So, when it comes to common, accidental, and essential, one of his claims is that the distinction between common and essential is the same as the distinction between accidental and essential, right? So he kind of just says it explicitly. This is false, right? Um, I guess for context, I should probably explain why we're bringing up this difference. Skeptical Agnostic's version of the LPI, according to him, has to do with things like ignorance or contingency being essential properties. And remember, for him, he thinks that if something is an essential property, that means all humans across all possible worlds have that property, right? So he thinks that all humans across all possible worlds are contingent and ignorant, right? Now, given that understanding or definition of essential property, we would deny that ignorance or contingency are essential. Rather, they are common, meaning that most or a large majority of humans have that property. And now, an example that's commonly given, I'm pretty sure Morris himself gives this example, is that suppose like someone is born on Mars. No other human would have that property, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be human just because they were born on Mars, right? Because the property of being born on Earth is a common property, but it's not an essential one, right? Because it's not required to be within the kind human. In fact, the reason why the Mars example works well has kind of to do with the fact that is that any reason you could give for like ignorance being essential could also work for being born on Earth, right? So, for example, if you wanted to argue that ignorance is essential in the modal sense because all humans you've met are ignorant in some sense, then one could argue the same thing for being born on Earth. Yet all humans I've met are born on Earth. Yeah, it's clearly metaphysically possible for someone to be like born on Mars, for example. Now, as like a final point on this, before we get to, I think this is next thing is supervenience, so that's Lamb. We can kind of just give some examples to show that accidental properties and common properties are not the same thing. So, being blue-eyed is an accident, but it isn't common. Being born on Earth is accidental but common. Being material is both common and essential, right? But obviously, no accident is essential. So I think that. So we're at supervenience. So Lamb, you kind of take it away, I guess.
Yeah, so he went over the supervenience and section, and he sort of had a lot of these sort of presuppositions on what specific sort of flavor of supervenience I was speaking about, and there was a lot of hand waving some points, and maybe not either paying attention to specific things I said, or just because of some sort of assumptions, he sort of like just carried on with like certain claims. The context of this section was it was a sort of like cherry on top, sort of informal explication. And this comes into play because he sort of like uses it to try to say that like I'm contradicting, Roy and Marionite scholastics like positions and such, and like to claim that like we have different positions and therefore like Roy's sort of explanation on certain things are like false. And I think there's like some big issues with that. The main contentions are going to be he brings up the issue of human nature's discursive knowledge somehow changing the divine logos' nature, in which he says, which I believe the following as such would be P1, if the logos learns and the logos attains knowledge, P2, attaining knowledge is change. In conclusion, therefore, the logos changes. Obviously, another issue here is the concept of change itself is going to be something that we would not even hold to, like this idea that like change is some like rigid designator, and therefore change is going to also be something that would go into like an intrinsic aspect rather than just being like aspectivalistic in some way, in which we would say there's a Cambridge change. There's again the issue with the type of supervenience he seems to posit. He assumes some basic or strict form of supervenience, even though I have distinguished multiple times throughout the video. Claims that the human nature's genuine finitude means there is no sense Christ has all propositional knowledge. There's a video on the Imago Logos channel you can check out, and it has a section in there where they actually respond to Dean Responds claims. I believe I can't remember, Roy, if it's the same video. Like you go over some of metaphysic Mike's and Jake's positions or not. If that's the video I'm
I
thinking
don't know
of.
about Jake. I mean, it might be easier if if Apollos pulls up the video so that people can just go check.
While he's doing that, I'll finish the last 2 points. There's like this claim that the informal metaphysical explication contradicts the formal models that Roy was giving. Again, this goes back to the point of like this sort of assumption that my part of the video was in the same way or sense that Roy's was, even though mine was very obviously an informal metaphysical explication. And then again, he brings up subsuming of sets of when it deals with the properties of these natures as it pertains to the subject. Again, that was already touched on pretty extensively. And I don't think I really need to deal with that as much.
And I think I have the video. It's this one, right, Roy? The one where we recorded it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just has some slide edits and stuff like that. So, yep.
You can go to the next slide. So to explain this supervenience specifically, so maybe it's a little easier to understand, I am stipulating a qualified use of supervenience. This would not be a strong covariance form. So the explanation I give, like when it talks about like A doing something and therefore B and so on and so forth at my section, was in a loose sense a covariance sort of position, but again, I stipulated right after that. The qualifications are in virtue of supervenience not being universally fixed metaphysical relations, since covariance isn't the same as grounding, and my position was specifically over asymmetrical grounding or non-competitive grounding. Contemporary metaphysics understands supervenience itself cannot explain dependence in that way, and treats supervenience more as a tracking dependence while explicating the grounding. Skeptical Agnostic assumes the strict analytical sense of every difference in supervenient level requires a corresponding intrinsic difference in base, and I'll cover that in a minute, why that's actually wrong, even on his own sort of terminology. Supervenient relations was explicated in a weaker metaphysical sense of asymmetrical ontological dependence, which the qualification of the relation was non-competitive grounding. The distinction here is what is metaphysically doing the work. And of course, the supervenience language is used to communicate ontological dependency rather than reciprocal covariance. It's more didactic when I'm trying to explain the entire sort of framework and specifically what this sort of field of philosophy is trying to explain when it comes to the incarnation. And go to the next slide.
All right, so this
Yeah.
was what I added before when we were talking about this. So I wanted to include some aspects where we see like prior precedents to this idea of supervenience, and this isn't just like a new thing to just like respond to people like in the modern day, but this was kind of an established principle that goes back to like the medieval age and even the like late early church with one of the fathers. So St. Thomas, every article he writes a sed contra, where he'll post he'll add an argument from authority for a certain dogma or like a certain doctrine. And here he writes about St. Damascene, where St. Damascene talks about the divine nature is said to be incarnate because it is united to the flesh personally, and not that it is changed into flesh. So that the flesh that is said to be deified, he also says, not by change, but by the union with the word, its natural property still remaining, and hence it may be considered as deified inasmuch as it becomes the flesh of the word of God.
Oh, it becomes the flesh of the word of God,
Sorry,
but not that
sorry,
it
one-
becomes God.
1 sec.
Yeah, you're good.
Sorry about that. Someone was calling for me. All right. In the other quotation from St. Thomas, in that same in the same volume, he says, quote, we must bear in mind that whatever there are several mutually ordained agents, the inferior is moved by the superior, as in man the body is moved by the soul and the lower powers by reason. And thus the actions and movements of the inferior principle are things operated rather than operations. And he says this in question 9, article 1 of Tertia Pars. We also see this in later commentators such as Johannes Wiggers, where he says that all the human actions of Christ are in line with the divine will. He says, quote, every human action of Christ was also willed by his divine will, because given the willing of the divine will with respect to this or that action, his human will, it nonetheless came about that the human will not only receive the action in itself, but that it itself efficiently elicited and produced it in itself. And this is not by way of the power of receiving an influx and move to act by command of another to which it necessarily moves itself, as a locomotive power operates by the command of the will, but entirely as a free power that is in its own order moved itself first, such that the human action proceeded from it as from a vital and free principle.
Yeah.
This is your
And
section.
yeah, and me and Maronite Scholastic have talked about this in the past when we were getting sources like that, which is that even though the language is more flowery and like the sort of concept of supervenience can be more modern age, these sort of ideas are still the same, which is why I qualify so heavily, because it's something that's important and it still pertains to Orthodox doctrine and such. So Skeptical Agnostic addressed the qualified supervenience position as if it's speaking of the subject of the logos in a lower and higher supervenience relation. So lower and higher supervenience relations are just saying, like, when we talk about like A supervenes on B, and then therefore there's a change, A, and B is not dependent on A, and such forth. Like the lower and higher supervenience relations, especially that in like physicalist supervenience, might say for like your mind and your brain have these like token brain states and token mental states. They use the lower and higher sort of language to represent a base, which is like the sort of intrinsic, and then the higher, which is the sort of like token states or operations in which these things take place. But however, I'm actually applying this more analogically. Even though I use these sort of language, I'm not using them in their definitive sense. I use these sorts of understandings of their relations and their operations to just speak about the ways that they actually sort of interact with one another. Again, we get over. I go over that in a few slides. Speaking analogically from the language of supervenience, it can be said that the logos plays the role of the metaphysical base, since the humanity needs him for its very existence. But while strict supervening relations entail constitutive substrates, in the present case, the logos is rather a constitutive ground of the assumed humanity, typically ontologically and hypostatically speaking. It's for this reason that the relation should be better termed asymmetrical grounding, which I did mention in the video, but I could understand why that may not have been something that was taken, at face value. So then, with that, what needs to be addressed is my main position, which is to say, human consciousness is asymmetrically grounded in the hypostatic logos. If we speak of the supervenience relation, it is only in the qualified sense that the human consciousness cannot exist apart from its hypostatic ground, not in the strong covariance sense or covariance reciprocal sense, whereby every alteration in the ground entails an intrinsic alteration in the grounding reality. I've pulled at least 3 objections. There wasn't like 2 of them kind of mixed, but the first objection, he actually talks about how if the human consciousness of Christ supervenes on the divine logos, this would be a problem because, supervening in the sense that he claims would cause these sort of contradictory positions to the impassibility and immutability of God, and therefore, if we allow supervenience to be this sort of concept that is within the incarnation, then therefore the impassibility and immutability of God must be restricted or false, and therefore one of the main doctrines of Christianity would be false. So I'm going to give again a 2-step epistemic critique of the objection, in which the first one is going to be skeptical agnostic specific assumptions, and then I'll elaborate further beyond that. The objection rests on this presupposition that supervenience is a 2-way relationship of property transfer. But again, the qualification of supervenience I give is an asymmetrical, which is a 1-way dependence relation. So if the human consciousness of Christ supervenes upon the logos, and the humanity of Christ is dependent on the logos as its ontological foundation, this does not mean that every change in the humanity of Christ necessarily implies any change in the logos, especially intrinsically. The immutability is predicated on the divine nature, not the person in every sense. So we can say Christ is immutable qua divinity, but mutable qua humanity. Right there we have these distinctions and predications. Therefore, Christ's human experience can vary independently of the immutability of the logos. The direction of dependence is incorrectly assumed. Remember, he's assuming this sort of 2-way dependency. Again, multiple times I said this was asymmetrically dependent, so dependency in one direction. So A depends on B, B does not depend on A, which, by the way, asymmetrical dependence or 1-way dependency is typically the use for the basic or weaker covariance understanding of supervenience. So, for example, a bronze statue depends on the bronze, but the bronze does not depend on the statue, because if the statue's form ceased to exist without the bronze, or it would cease to exist without the bronze, but the bronze would not, and the bronze would still exist. This also equivocates between covariance and reciprocal change, or you can just say they're called reciprocal covariance. So even under this supposed view of supervenience, going from supervenience involves correspondence to the logos must change whenever the human nature goes through change is not covariance in its typical sense. Again, it would be a strong sense of covariance, which is the reciprocal covariance. So for example, suppose we say the shape of a statue supervenes on the bronze. If the bronze is reshaped, then the statue changes. However, vice versa, this would kind of fail because the statue changes, making the bronze reshaped would kind of be wacky. The description and change of the statue's form does not reshape the bronze in such a way it acquires new intrinsic properties beyond the configuration. So, for example, just because the form of the statue or any change to statue, like i.e. like I take it and move it to another corner, does not then entail that the bronze like loses some percentage of copper, or it now has a specific higher percentage of aluminum, nickel, phosphorus, or any sort of thing like that. We understand that like those things are still preserved and the intrinsic properties are still there, even if there is a change to the form, which we would understand. Likewise, the logos is an ontological grounding for the assumed humanity. The humanities undergoing some sort of change simply means the different human states are instantiated. It does not entail the logos acquires new attributes or intrinsic changes. So again, you can sort of just compare that to the bronze statue example here. The same sort of idea applies. It also assumes intrinsic change rather than relational change. We distinguish between the intrinsic and the extrinsic Cambridge change, which would be a relational. The objection also confuses the hypostases with a person with nature. Skeptical Agnostic ignores the distinctions, which his objection would only follow if persons is nature, which Chalcedonian language explicitly denies. The person is the acting subject, and the nature specifies the mode of operation. So we can say that Christ suffered on the cross qua humanity because the instantiation of suffering is predicated to the nature. However, the understanding of Christ also being God, so the divine logos assuming the flesh, doesn't alter the instantiation in such a way the logos simpliciter attains suffering. So again, going back to that bronze statue sort of example, just because the sort of human instantiations are going through some sort of temporal change or some sort of phenomenological change doesn't mean that the intrinsic grounding is going to alter as well. Both these predications can be assumed via communicatio idiomatum. I hope I said that right. I don't know Latin that great. Skeptical Agnostic assumes that every personal predication is an essential predication in this sort of logic.
Real quick, just to answer this, it's a question for me. Jesus is obviously the firstborn of all creation. Who do you think was the secondborn of all creation? It kind of depends on your view of Genesis, but it also misunderstands what it means for Jesus to be the firstborn of all creation. Not necessarily that his human nature was instantiated first among everyone else, but rather that his I guess you could say his the honors of being a firstborn within that ancient Near Eastern context would be applied to him. So that would be my answer. But anyway, back to you, Lamb.
I actually have a whole article on Christ as firstborn as illustrated by Saint Cyril. So if you want to go read that, you can check out my Substack.
Yeah, go check out his slop stack.
So it's true.
Yeah, so the next two objections are going to be a little bit shorter than the first one. The first one was the primary sort of conflict in that dialogue. So in objection 2, there are sort of two parts, but they're kind of like relevant here. So the first one is just to say that I seem to be contradicting premise 21 of the logically consistent model that Roy gave. And because, what I said about the sort of human consciousness genuine finitude somehow is incorrect in accordance to what Roy's model was saying. And Roy can correct me if I'm wrong, but and when we get to the reply, I'll explain a little bit, but obviously this isn't true. And then, of course, when he talks about change, he actually does acknowledge that we speak of change, the Cambridge sense, analogically to Christ, depending on the specific instantiations. And then he just goes on to say that, like, well, it's just ad hoc, or like that's change anyways, regardless if it's aspectivalistic, and therefore, because of something I read from St. Aquinas on Reddit, they're like, then that means that like it's contradictory, but that's not true. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so the reply to this, the objections based on the confusion between the omniscience of the divine logos and the cognitive content of Christ's human consciousness. So I had said nothing about the transfer of omniscience to the human consciousness, and again, this is proper to the actual properties. So I'm not saying that the human consciousness therefore gets some sort of property transfer and it gets omniscience, nor do I believe that's what Roy is saying either. And Roy can correct me if I'm wrong. He's also not saying there's a property transfer and therefore the human consciousness gains omniscience, at least not in that sense.
Well, I mean, to kind of, I guess you could say, illustrate most, so the view that Christ is omniscient qua man isn't exactly like unique to like me. It's like part of like Catholic tradition, Orthodox tradition, Lutheran tradition, obviously, right? But most will say that it's just part of the fact that the human nature is kind of deified. So the knowledge would be infused in that way, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, and like I said, Christ may be an omniscient person because the logos has a because of the logos and has a finite human consciousness because of his humanity, and this is because of the asymmetrical dependency and grounding.
Right. Well, one thing I like to add is that I feel like there's this alleged, like, he says this, that because you said the human mind was finite, that therefore it contradicted me when I said that it was omniscient, right? But the issue is that being finite and not being, or being finite and being ignorant are not like the same thing. Because, for example, to give one metaphysical paradigm that might have something like this, Thomists usually will say that the soul has potency, right? So it's a substantial form that actualizes like prime matter, if you will, in their view. But it also has its own potency, and Buston can speak on this, right? Because it moves from moves from potential to act, and obviously anything with potency is going to be finite. So, and remember, even under the Thomistic view, the human mind of Christ is still omniscient in a sense. So,
Yeah, willful ignorance is literally a thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so with like the finite mind, right? So under like a Thomistic view, they would say that the soul of Christ is finite in the sense of having potency, but it's still omniscient in the sense of having all free knowledge.
Yeah, and my position specifically was referring to proper predicates. So, and again, I reject the idea of sort of like transferring of properties just because there's like an assumption. I believe it functions in a different manner, but at least as it pertains to that section of the video, I never like mentioned anything that would actually contradict that premise. Yeah, and the incarnation is not a changing God, as Maronite Scholastic had put. There's a new grounding relation to human consciousness created by God. Claiming that the new relation is a changing God amounts to saying that a new relation involves property inheritance, which classical theists reject. And I would also put like a lot of metaphysical, academics would reject this too. We wouldn't say that every relational change is therefore property inheritance, alterations, or transference of properties. We wouldn't, like, you'd have to say, like, for example, I occur a relational change by becoming an uncle, like, or I occur a relational change by doing X with someone else. but that doesn't then therefore change my essential or innate properties in any way that's actually like. So that's was very interesting that seems to be this sort of assumption that there's like an innate change.
Right,
Um,
that would be like a Cambridge change because
exactly.
you like let's say your brother has like a kid, right, and you become an uncle because of that. Um, the moment that your brother has a kid, that's the moment that you go from not being an uncle to being an uncle. But there's no potency that's actualized in you when you go from that, right? So it's not like it's not like when your brother or it's not like when your nephew is like conceived that like suddenly just potency gets actualized from you being not an uncle to being an uncle. More so it's like a Cambridge change because as you said it would be relational.
Yeah.
Because it would be that the what's it called? It would be a change in your brother and the generation of a new sort of person that causes you to be an uncle. It's not really the other way around.
Yeah. And then the ad hoc claim, claims are not arguments in and of themselves. I was never evading any counterexamples without independent theoretical motivation. All the philosophical concepts that I used pertain specifically to the sort of thing that we're talking about, and they play explanatory roles independently of the objection. So skeptical agnostic needs to give some justification to the contrary to claim that I'm actually utilizing ad hoc reasoning. Otherwise, I'm just going to treat this as a baseless assumption. Objection 3. This one is talking about the aseity aspect of God, in which he speaks about these classical concepts of God, if they're ase, and if there is these sort of assumption of a human nature, therefore the human nature either has to also be ase, or like the logos is not ase, especially when inquiring supervenience relations, because again he goes back to this contradiction of gaining knowledge, and if one is ase versus one that's not, then therefore the supervenience could not make any sense. So this objection can be structured as such to say the divine nature is ase, the human nature supervenes on the divine nature, the human nature is not ase, therefore there is a contradiction. This could only follow if the hidden assumption is that whatever supervenes must possess all of the essential properties of its grounding. This is patently false for supervening relations. Skeptical agnostic would hopefully not agree that this would also follow, which is physical states have mass, mental states supervene on physical states, therefore mental states also have mass. These properties of the grounding are not necessarily inherited by what is grounding. So just because something supervenes on the base does not mean that therefore it now acquires all of these inherited properties or innate properties, and physicalists would definitely not say mental states have mass just because it supervenes on physical states that have mass, and which would be your brain or your neurons and such. I believe this is the last slide. So ultimately, this objection rests on the presupposition that anything that is ontologically grounded by something else will have the same modal properties, which include aseity. However, supervenience and grounding do not operate as property transferring relations, but rather as asymmetric dependence relations. So my position is that human consciousness is ontologically grounded by the logos, but yet remains a true creation and contingency of human consciousness. Again, as Roy explained, it has like potency. The attribute of aseity pertains to the divine nature, while contingency pertains to the human nature. This again goes back to that same sort of talk. Given that these predicates pertain to the two distinct natures of the same person or subject of Christ, there is no contradiction. In fact, it is quite natural for there not to be aseity in the humanity, because it is completely dependent on the aseity of logos. So ultimately, I think that the aseity objection was pretty weak, and I think that it definitely assumed a specific understanding of supervenience that pretty much missed the mark entirely of my section of the video. But yeah, that's it.
I guess we have one last thing to wrap it up. So, skeptical agnostic kind of argues that our regimentation or like the formalization contradicts the Bible because also for some reason he calls it a premise. It's not a premise. It's just it's a sentence. A premise would assume that there's like some conclusion, but you know it's like that. That's not really like a premise in some argument. It's just a sentence within a theory. But anyways, um, basically he kind of contests that, well, hey, you know, according to Mark 13:32, Jesus is ignorant. Same with Luke 2:50, I think 2. So therefore, does it make sense to say that Jesus knows all things qua humanity? So, you know, therefore contradiction. Well, the obvious issue is that we already responded to the objection from Mark 13:32 and Luke 2:52 in another video. I'm pretty sure we displayed that on screen as well, so just refer to that. Furthermore, even if it's not consistent with the Bible, that's still sufficient. Or I'm sorry, that still isn't sufficient to prove that the doctrine is formally or metaphysically inconsistent. Basically, you could grant that something is unbiblical, and yet that doesn't help his case, right? Because he's trying to argue that it's metaphysically or formally inconsistent. Also, you can always just remove that particular formula and the account would still be consistent, right? Because like worst case scenario, let's say that my inclusion of that formula would make like the set of sentences inadequate, right? Okay, sure, we can just remove that then, and there you go. You just get back to the like if you go to the next slide. Once you remove that formula, nothing within the set entails that Jesus has all propositional knowledge, meaning that you can just remove that and then have a model where Jesus would not know all things qua human mind, right? So even like worst case scenario, the Christ qua man being omniscient claim, even if that's inadequate, it really doesn't affect much because you can just remove the formula. And yeah, references, nothing really else besides that.
Yay, we did it.
Speaking of which, does he ever define like unbiblical? Because like, does he just mean it's not in like
I think he means
scripture?
that it would contradict the Bible, like.
Okay.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I also put up an article on whether Christ knew the hour. If anybody wants to check that out, if you want a more concise view.
Yeah,
But
that's
you
on a
guys could also go
Substack.
check out the video as well.
Yeah. Also, to clarify another point is, because I'm not a Thomist, so I don't hold to the same specific understandings of like how omniscience or knowledge or phenomenology pertains to the natures per se as a Thomist would. That still doesn't. I don't think that even does anything whatsoever. It was like a really weird point where he's like, "Well, then this would contradict like premise 21." And let's say it does. Let's say that like my position is completely contrary. That doesn't matter. Like you would just take it like, okay, either I'm wrong or Roy's wrong. That doesn't mean that like therefore it follows that the incarnation is illogical or metaphysically infeasible. Like to me that made kind of no sense.
I mean,
So
yeah, it's kind of. I don't know. I feel like it was kind of reminded me of when he kind of shifted from incoherence to like explanatory virtues, which was kind of weird. Like when he talked about like whether there's one principle or zero principles, right? And besides, I think we've covered everything, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yes, sir. So I'll be adding Bust Down's Maronite Scholastic Substack. Pretty straightforward URL right there. He's got a lot of articles when it comes to Catholic theology and so on and so forth. Any upcoming projects, I guess?
Well,
Maronite?
people on my that you meant all of us.
Yeah, I'm working on a paper for Mary's role in the economy of salvation right now. That should be coming out in the future over the
wait,
like month.
economy?
Yeah,
Oh boy,
Wait, you're EO?
bro, son.
I guess.
Oh yeah. Also, Bust Down is I guess he's still offering the debate on like perpetual virginity on the IP server. Right? You never really took that offer away, did you?
No, I never rescinded it, but no one like put it forward. I did. There was that one guy that put forward a challenge to people who held the Thomistic or Augustinian view on double predestination, I suppose.
Then we got
So,
you,
like, that's
Lamb.
like the only one.
Anything else? I know you haven't posted in a while, but
Yeah, so I'm actually so I had been pretty busy with work. I worked like 12-hour shifts, and it was a pretty horrendous 2 months. But I am back to doing apologetics a lot more frequently. I've just been working on a bunch of stuff at once, so be prepared. I am making a response video to Shang or Mindful Living on his sort of misunderstanding on how Bayesian epistemology is applied to like historical reportage model and miracles. Making a video about miracles, I'll actually explain why I think the argument of miracles is a lot stronger than we think, and I think it's like it could possibly be top 3. I don't know, put it in S tier. At least the way that like someone like me, or you might find someone like Than, talking about like from IP, talking about, miracles with a little bit more of like an sort of like inferential or epistemological Bayesian explanation. And then, so probably doing that, trying to do more debates. I get blacklisted a lot. I'm a pseudo-philosopher, so people don't really like speaking to me, specifically Muslims. I might post, I just did a debate like on TikTok, as a side quest. There was like, I guess, a pretty big atheist British TikToker, and it was interesting. I might cut clips from that and post it, but I will be posting frequently, and soon I will be streaming, so.
Awesome. And then we got you, Roy.
Well, I mean, my bad for interrupting earlier. I thought you meant all of us, but I guess the one thing I have in works right now is people voted on my channel. They wanted me to do a video on whether you can know the Trinity from reason, and I'd say that's like the script for that is like 70% done. I'd say.
Mm-hmm. The answer is read Hegel.
No, I don't think Ryan read.
Yeah, and then as for me, so interestingly enough, I more Asher interviews will be uploaded to my channel, so that would be a nice way for me to maintain the content throughput while also maintaining a full-time job. But aside from that, I've got no upcoming debates. I might do like a call-in. No, I will do a call-in stream with one of my friends here soon in a bit. He reached out to me, and I think we're gonna meet up this weekend, and we'll be deciding some details regarding that soon. And as usual, I'm always working on that mega dissertation on how do you make the inference from miracle to religion. So like, I remember when I first met Tim Howard, that was literally the first thing I brought up, was like, I want to understand like how miracles are not underdeterminative when it comes to inferring religion. But that's the stream, guys. You heard it right here. The Trinity, the Incarnation, it's all coherent. And please give this stream a big like, share, and subscribe. So until then, this is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace. You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member for Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Your partnership helps with creating original Christian apologetics research, gets you exclusive access to videos, and more. Want to catch me personally online? Well, feel free to join our Discord server. But in any case, Christianity is true, apologetics is base. This is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace.